Hello, my friend. Get comfortable. Because tonight, we're travelling back to England's dark ages, to a world where Roman roads were slowly disappearing into the landscape, and ordinary families carried on with their lives among the remains of a civilization they barely remembered. Before we begin, if these slow journeys into the past help you relax or drift off to sleep, leaving a like and subscribing helps this little channel find someone else who needs it too. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you might think. While you settle in, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Maybe it's a quiet evening in Vermont, a little home somewhere in Yorkshire, or a peaceful night in the countryside outside Melbourne. Leave it in the comments. I really do read every single one. All right, my friend, let us begin. Hild woke before the birds did, which was not unusual, and lay still for a moment listening to her husband breathe beside her, slow and even, and to the small, private sounds of a house settling into morning. She was 34 years old, which in the year 831, in a village called Witchcombe on the edge of the Wessex woodland, made her a woman with 2 children nearly grown, a woman who could set a broken bone, who knew which mushrooms would kill a man and which would only make him sick for a day, and who had never in her life travelled more than 20 miles from the bed she was lying in now. Her husband's name was Ælfric. He farmed 6 acres that belonged, technically, to a lord neither of them had ever met, a man whose name changed twice in Hild's lifetime as one kinsman replaced another in ways that had very little to do with anyone in Witchcombe, and everything to do with wars fought in places she could not have pointed to. The room was dark and cold in the particular way a house gets cold just before dawn, when the fire has burned down to a bed of orange coals and has not yet been coaxed back up. Hild lay there a moment longer, listening, and her mind went, as it often did in these first waking minutes, to something her own grandmother used to say, a small, strange fact that had lodged itself in Hild since childhood, and never quite worked itself loose. Her grandmother had been born within living memory of Roman Britain. Not the Rome of soldiers and villas at its peak that had ended long before, but a grandmother who as a small child had still seen the paved road that ran 2 miles from Witchcombe, mostly intact, with grass growing in the cracks but the stones still fitted together, still doing more or less what Roman engineers 4 centuries earlier had built it to do. By the time Hild herself walked that same road as a girl, it was not really a road anymore. It was a raised ridge of rubble running through the forest, half swallowed by bramble, useful mostly as a landmark, a place where you might say to a stranger, "Follow the old stoneway until it bends north," and they would know exactly what you meant, even though not one person walking it that year could have told you who built it, or why, or what the empire that made it had actually looked like. There was a stone at the edge of the mill pond, half sunk in the mud, that had letters carved into it. Everyone in Witchcombe knew the stone. Children dared each other to touch it after dark, because there was a story, half serious, that it had been placed there by giants, since who else could have carved such perfectly straight lines into rock that hard? Hild's own son, Born, who was 12 that year, and had a habit of asking questions that made adults uncomfortable, had once traced the letters with his finger and asked his father what they said. Ælfric had looked at the stone for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he has walked past 1,000 times without really seeing, and admitted that he did not know. Nobody in the village knew. It was not that reading itself had vanished from England, not entirely, not yet. It survived, thinly, in a handful of places, mostly behind monastery walls, tended by men who treated the skill the way you might tend a fire in a long winter, carefully, anxiously, aware of how easily it could go out. But in a farming village like Witchcombe, 3 days' walk from the nearest religious house with a library worth the name, literacy was not a skill anyone possessed. It was a rumour. It was something that happened elsewhere, to other kinds of people. I want to sit with that for a second, the stone and the road both, because I think it is easy to hear a phrase like loss of literacy and picture something abstract, a statistic in a textbook, when the reality of it was intensely personal and small. It is not that people in Hild's world were ignorant, not the way that word gets used sometimes as an insult. It is that an entire civilization had come and gone, had left behind roads and walls and the bones of cities, and within a few generations nobody left alive had a clear memory of what any of it had been for. It meant that when Hild's mother died, there was no letter written about her, no record beyond what people chose to remember and repeat aloud. It meant that if a dispute arose over who owned a strip of land, there was no document to settle it, only the memory of old men, which was trusted, genuinely trusted, as a kind of legal instrument, because it was often the only instrument available, and it meant that a stone carved 400 years earlier by people who had thought of themselves as thoroughly civilized, as heirs to an empire that would surely last forever, sat half sunk in mud at the edge of a mill pond, entirely mute, its message intact and utterly inaccessible, like a locked door with no one left alive who remembered where the key had gone. Elfric was already up and moving by the time Hild rose properly, pulling on the same undyed wool tunic he wore most days, the wool coarse enough that you could hear it against his skin if you were listening for it. He had gone out to check on the ox, an animal named, with a total absence of poetic ambition, simply Ox, who was old and slow, and whose replacement Elfric had been quietly saving toward for 2 years without telling Hild exactly how close he was, because he liked having one thing in the world that was entirely his own secret, small as it was. Hild pulled the covers off her daughter, a girl of 9 named Ealhswith, who groaned in the particular way that children groan at being woken, and burrowed further into the blanket, which was itself a repurposed cloak, stitched and restitched so many times that its original shape had long since stopped mattering. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was quick and unceremonious. A heel of yesterday's bread, dense and dark, made from a mix of barley and whatever rye had come in that year, softened in a cup of something between broth and water. Nobody sat down for it properly. You ate standing, or walking, or with a child balanced on one hip, because the morning did not wait for anyone to finish chewing. And it was in the middle of this, with Ealhswith complaining that the bread had gone hard on one side and Bjorn already halfway out the door to check the sheep, that they heard the dog start up down the lane, the particular bark that meant a stranger, not an alarm, just an announcement, and Aelfric straightened and looked toward the door with the mild, practised alertness of a man who had learned, over many years, exactly how much attention a stranger deserved before you knew who they were. It was Ceolwulf. Word had reached the village 2 days earlier, the way word always did, past farmer to farmer across field boundaries, that a trader had been seen on the road from the east, and so his arrival was not a total surprise, though it was still an event, the kind of small occasion that reorganised an entire morning around it. Ceolwulf travelled with a pack-horse, in a manner that suggested he had long ago made peace with being distrusted on sight in every village he entered, which was simply the nature of the work. He carried salt which was valuable enough that he kept it wrapped and guarded the way another man might guard silver. He carried a handful of small iron implements, needles and fishhooks, made somewhere else by hands neither he nor anyone in Witchcombe had ever seen. And in a leather pouch he handled with visible care, he carried something that made even Hild, who did not consider herself an easily impressed woman, come closer to look. Glass beads, blue and green, small as peas, cool and slightly heavy in the palm. This is the detail that I think gets lost in how people imagine this period. We call it the Dark Ages, and the name suggests something closed off, cut away from the rest of the world, a little island of mud and superstition with the shutters drawn. But those beads had travelled an extraordinary distance to end up in a farmer's palm in a village. Most maps, if maps had existed in any usable form, would not have bothered to mark. The workshops that made beads like these sat at the end of trade threads running down into continental Europe and further still toward the Mediterranean and the edges of the Islamic world. Silver coins minted in Frankish territories turned up in English hoards from this period. Quernstones, the heavy grinding stones used to mill grain, were sometimes imported specifically because certain continental rock held an edge better than anything English stone could offer, and a farmer would pay handsomely for a stone that would grind flour faster and finer, for 20 years instead of 5. None of this made Witchcombe wealthy or connected in any way its residents would have recognised using that word. But it complicates the picture of total isolation that the phrase Dark Ages tends to conjure. The world Hild lived in was fragmented, yes, unrecorded in most of its particulars, yes, vulnerable in ways her grandmother's generation could not have imagined. But it was not sealed shut. Thread still ran through it, thin and easily broken, carrying salt and beads and rumour and, every so often, something closer to real news, from places whose names most people in the village had never heard and never would. Ceolwulf did not stay long, a night at most, sleeping in the byre with his horse rather than accept the awkward formality of a stranger's bed, and by mid-morning he was gone again, on toward whichever village lay next along his circuit. But before he left he mentioned, almost in passing, that the lord who held the land 2 valleys over had died that winter, and that his holdings had passed to a nephew nobody in these parts had ever met. Ælfric received this news the way he received most news of lords and kings, with a small nod and no particular change of expression, because in truth it barely touched him. He went back to mending a broken hurdle almost before Ceolwulf's cart had cleared the lane, and the rest of the morning passed the way most mornings did, Hild scouring the milk pail, Eels with chasing a hen that had gotten loose, the whole household simply carrying on. It was only that evening, sitting by the fire with the day's work finally done, that Hild found herself turning the news over properly, and it is worth understanding, sitting with it now, what a piece of news like that actually meant in the world Hild and Ælfric lived in. England in the year 831 was not one country in any sense we would recognise now. It was a shifting arrangement of kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, Northumbria, and smaller powers folded inside and between them, and the boundaries of who owed loyalty to whom could change within a single lifetime, sometimes within a single decade, as one king's fortunes rose and another's collapsed on a battlefield most ordinary people would never see and might not even hear about until months later. For a family like Hild's, this meant something very specific and very practical. It meant that the person you technically owed labour and produce to, the person whose name was invoked when the reeve came around collecting dues, could change without any of the actual texture of your life changing at all. You still farmed the same 6 acres. You still owed roughly the same amount of grain and labour at roughly the same times of year. What changed was a name, spoken by a man on a horse who arrived perhaps twice a year, collected what was owed, asked a few questions about the harvest, and left again. Loyalty in this world was not the grand, sworn, permanent thing it sometimes gets portrayed as in later stories. It was layered and local, and often quite thin at the edges, especially the further down the social ladder you stood. A king might command fierce, personal loyalty from the warriors who ate at his table and owed their status directly to his favour. A farming family 3 valleys from his nearest hall owed him, in practice, obedience and grain, and precious little else, and would have struggled to describe, if pressed, exactly why their loyalty belonged to him rather than the king one border over. It is strange to think about, honestly, how little the grand political architecture of the period actually touched the daily texture of most lives. Wars were fought, alliances made and broken, kings crowned and occasionally murdered, and for a household like Hild's, the practical effect was often nothing more than a different name, mentioned by the man who came to collect the harvest tithe. Not always, of course. When the fighting came close, when armies actually moved through a region rather than simply existing somewhere over the horizon, everything changed, and changed brutally. But most years, for most people, the great churn of kings and kingdoms was background noise, a kind of weather system operating several layers above the one that actually determined whether you ate well that winter or went hungry. That evening, an old man from further down the lane came by, as he often did, drawn less by any specific errand than by the simple pull of another household's fire and another family's conversation. His name was Osric, and he had, by his own count, seen 62 winters, which made him by a considerable margin the oldest person in Wychcombe, and which afforded him a particular kind of authority that had nothing to do with wealth or land and everything to do with memory. Osric remembered things. Not history in any grand sense, but the specific textured memory of a place, which crops had failed in which years and why, which families had intermarried 3 generations back, which parts of the woods were said to be unlucky, and which stream never froze even in the hardest winter. He also carried, comfortably and without any apparent sense of contradiction, a set of beliefs that sat somewhere between the old ways and the newer Christian faith the region had formerly practiced for close to 2 centuries. He crossed himself when he entered the house, out of habit more than devotion, and then, settling by the fire, told Ellsworth, who had asked him something about the moon, that a ring around the moon meant rain within 3 days, and that if you saw a single magpie you were meant to greet it aloud and ask after its family, to ward off the bad luck a lone magpie was said to carry. He mentioned, too, almost as an afterthought, that his own mother had kept a small carved figure on the lintel of her door, a habit from her mother before her, a habit older than the church itself in that part of the country, and that when the priest had visited 2 summers back and noticed it, he had said nothing at all, only looked at it for a moment, and moved on to blessing the animals, as though some quiet agreement had been reached long ago between the old customs and the new faith, an agreement nobody had ever written down or formally announced, but that everyone somehow understood. This blending fascinates me every time I come back to it, because it resists the tidy story we often tell about religious conversion, the idea of one belief system cleanly replacing another. What actually happened across England through the 7th, 8th and 9th centuries was messier and more human than that. Christianity became the dominant, official faith, yes, sincerely held by many, including people like Osric who crossed himself without a second thought, but underneath it, and sometimes woven directly through it, older habits of thought persisted, not as active rebellion against the church, but simply as the accumulated wisdom of a people who had been reading omens in birds and weather and the behavior of animals for longer than anyone could remember, and who saw no particular reason to stop just because a new set of holy days had been layered over the old ones. Christmas itself, celebrated in Witchcombe with a feast and a rest from labour, fell suspiciously close to the old midwinter observances that had marked the turning of the year long before any missionary had set foot on English soil, and nobody in the village seemed troubled by the overlap. Why would they be? The point, as far as anyone in Witchcombe was concerned, was that the dark half of the year was ending and the light half was coming back, and that was worth marking however you chose to mark it. Aelfric had taken a bad cut across his forearm 3 days earlier, wrestling a fence post out of ground that had frozen and thawed and frozen again until the wood was gripped like a fist, and though Hild had packed it with the usual mixture of yarrow and honey, the wound had gone an angry red that worried her more than she let on to him. Osric looked at it and said little, which from Osric was itself a kind of verdict. So the following morning Aelfric made the decision, without much discussion, to walk the half-day's journey to the monastery at Diorum, where the brothers kept a small infirmary, and more importantly to a family like theirs, a monk with genuine skill in what passed for medicine in that part of the world. Hild went with him, glad of an excuse to see the place again, and left the children with a neighbour for the day. The monastery sat on a low rise above the river, visible from a distance by its bell tower, which was, without much competition, the tallest structure Hild had ever personally laid eyes on. Inside its walls existed a version of literacy and learning that had almost entirely vanished from the world outside them. This is worth pausing on, because monasteries in this period functioned as something closer to a kind of ark, quietly preserving skills and knowledge that had nearly gone extinct across most of the country. The monks kept books, copied by hand, letter by careful letter, onto parchment made from scraped and treated animal skin, a process so labour-intensive that a single substantial book might represent months, sometimes years, of one man's working life. They kept records of land grants, of disputes settled, of deaths and successions, the kind of documentation that had simply stopped existing for people like Hild's family the moment Roman administration collapsed. And they kept, importantly, a body of medical knowledge drawn partly from classical texts that had survived in fragments, and partly from herbal wisdom accumulated and passed down within the walls themselves. Wilfrid was the monk who saw to Aelfric, a man perhaps 50 years old, with the particular pale, indoor quality of someone who had spent decades bent over manuscripts in poor light. He cleaned the wound with a wash that stung enough to make Ælfric hiss through his teeth, packed it with a paste that smelled sharply of something Hild could not place, and bound it with a strip of clean linen, all with a gentleness that surprised her slightly, though she would not have admitted to expecting anything else. He also did something that struck her as almost unbearably strange to witness. He wrote her husband's name down. On a small scrap of parchment, in a neat, economical hand, he wrote Ælfric, and the date, and a brief note of the injury, so that if the wound worsened and he was brought back to the infirmary, the brothers would have some record of what had come before. Nobody had ever written Ælfric's name before, not that either of them knew of. Hild stood there for a moment, watching ink dry on parchment, and felt something she did not entirely have words for, a kind of vertigo at the sheer permanence of it, the idea that her husband's name now existed independent of anyone's memory, fixed and unchanging, in a form that could theoretically be read by someone not yet born. It was such a small thing, a few marks on a scrap of skin, and yet it represented an entire technology of memory that the rest of her world had almost completely lost. I think this is one of the most quietly moving aspects of monastic life in this period, the way these institutions functioned as guardians of continuity in a world that had, in most other respects, lost its thread. The brothers at a monastery like Diarum were not simply pious men withdrawn from the world, though piety was plainly central to why they were there. They were, whether they thought of themselves this way or not, the primary reason that certain kinds of knowledge did not vanish entirely from England during this period. Medical texts describing the properties of plants, some going back to classical antiquity, survived because monks copied and recopied them, generation after generation, correcting errors as best they could, adding local observations of their own. Historical records survived the same way, which is a large part of why we know anything at all, today, about a period so often described as having left almost nothing behind. It left more than people think. It simply left it in a small number of guarded, candlelit rooms, tended by men who understood, in a way the rest of the population mostly did not have the luxury to consider, just how fragile the whole enterprise of remembering actually was. Wilfrid asked, as Hild was preparing to leave, whether anyone in her household could read even a little, and when she said no, not one of them, he did not react with any particular surprise or judgment, only nodded, the way a man nods at weather he has seen many times before. He mentioned, almost gently, that this was true of nearly every household that came through the infirmary door, and that it had been true, as far as he understood from the older brothers, for longer than anyone at Diarum could clearly remember. There had been a time, he said, generations back, when even ordinary families in parts of England had kept some contact with letters, however thin. That time had passed. What remained now, mostly, was contained here, behind these walls, in these books, tended like a small fire that could not be allowed to go out, because nobody was entirely certain it could be relit if it did. The walk home from Diorum took most of the afternoon, and Hild found herself, as she often did on that particular stretch of road, thinking less about the monastery behind her than about the life waiting ahead. Bjorn would be minding the sheep, or pretending to, more likely daydreaming about the smith's forge in the next village over, where he had taken to spending any spare hour he could steal, watching the smith work iron with a fascination that had nothing performed about it. Ælfric had noticed it too, and though he had said nothing outright, Hild suspected he was already turning over the idea of an apprenticeship in his mind, weighing what the household could afford to lose in labour against what their son might gain. It was not a decision either of them would make quickly. Decisions in a household like theirs rarely were. Everything cost something, and the cost was almost never money. Not really, but time and hands, and the narrow margin between a good harvest and a hard winter. There was a particular pride Hild took in watching this begin, quiet and unannounced, the way most real teaching in her world tended to happen, one generation simply making room for the next to learn by watching closely enough. Ealhswith, for her part, had already begun learning to spin, sitting for an hour most evenings with a drop spindle her grandmother had once used, twisting raw wool into thread with a concentration well beyond what most 9-year-olds could manage. This was not incidental. Spinning, weaving, the entire slow architecture of turning fleece into cloth represented one of the largest blocks of labour in any household of this period, and it fell, almost without exception, to women and girls, taught hand to hand, generation to generation, with no book involved anywhere in the process. Hild herself had learnt from her mother exactly as her mother had learnt from hers, watching the angle of the wrist, the tension of the thread, the particular twist that kept wool from either snapping under strain or hanging so loose it would never hold together as cloth. There was no written pattern for any of it. If Hild died tomorrow without having taught her daughter thoroughly enough, some fraction of that knowledge would simply be gone, the way so much knowledge in this world existed only as long as someone living remembered it and someone younger was willing to sit still long enough to learn. The same was true of nearly everything that kept a household like theirs alive through a year. How to read the sky for the smell of coming frost, sharp and metallic, distinct enough that Osric claimed he could smell a hard freeze coming a full day before it arrived, which wild plants, gathered at exactly the right week of their season, could be dried or pickled or packed in salt to see a family through the lean months between the last of autumn's stores and the first thin green of spring. How to judge, by the particular restlessness of the animals, that a storm was coming well before any cloud had appeared on the horizon. None of it was written anywhere. All of it lived in the bodies and memories of people like Osric and Hild, and increasingly in Elswith's small, careful hands as she learnt to spin. There is something in that I find myself truly admiring, honestly, the sheer density of practical intelligence required simply to survive a year in that world. Intelligence that left almost no trace in any record because it was never considered worth recording. Historians, working centuries later, have had to reconstruct much of it sideways, through archaeology, through the rare surviving text that mentions farming practice almost as an aside, through comparison with slightly better documented periods before and after. The people actually living it, people like Hild, would have found the whole idea faintly absurd, the notion that anyone might need to reconstruct knowledge that, to her, was simply how the world worked, as obvious and unremarkable as breathing. That evening, after the animals were settled and the children asleep, Hild sat with Aelfric by the last of the fire, mending a tear in his second tunic while he sharpened a blade with slow, unhurried strokes. It was in these quiet stretches, the ones with no particular purpose beyond simply being together at the end of a long day, that she sometimes found herself thinking about the coast. She had grown up not in Witchcombe but nearly 2 days' journey east of it, in a smaller settlement close enough to the sea that on clear days you could smell salt on the wind even from the fields. She rarely spoke of it. Aelfric knew the broad shape of her childhood, knew she had come to this village at 17 to marry him, knew her parents were long dead, and her only surviving kin from that side lived scattered and distant enough that visits had become, over the years, a kind of formality exchanged in memory rather than in practice. What he did not fully know, what she had never found the right words to give him, was what she had seen there once, as a girl of 11, on a morning that had started like any other and ended with the entire village standing frozen at the top of the dunes, watching low shapes move along the water that were not fishing boats. I want to be careful here, because this is not a story about violence, and I do not intend to make it one. What Hild remembered, when she let herself remember it at all, was not really the raiders themselves, who had, as it happened, passed that particular stretch of coast without landing, moving on to strike somewhere further along the shore that her village heard about only second-hand, in fragments, days later. What she remembered was the waiting, the hour or more of standing on the dunes in complete silence, her mother's hand gripping hers hard enough to leave marks, the entire community holding its breath together, watching those low, fast shapes on the water, and understanding, with a clarity she had never fully shaken, that safety was not a permanent condition. It was something borrowed, temporarily, and it could be taken back without warning, without explanation, without any regard at all for whether you happened to be ready. She had never told Aelfric the particular shape of that fear, not because she was hiding something shameful, but because there had simply never been a moment that seemed to call for it, and because some part of her suspected that saying it aloud would make it more real than she wanted it to be, here, in this warm, ordinary room, with her husband's hands moving steadily over a blade, and her children breathing evenly in the next room. So she kept it where she had always kept it, folded small and put away, taken out only in moments like this one, quiet and unguarded, when the fire was low, and the house was still, and there was nothing left to do but sit with her own thoughts for a while before sleep. The days moved on the way they always did in Witchcombe, one folding into the next with a rhythm dictated less by any calendar than by the fields themselves, and it was perhaps a fortnight after the walk to Dereham that a dispute broke out between two families at the far end of the village over a boundary stone that one man swore had always stood in one place and another swore, with equal conviction, had been moved. It sounds like a small thing, and in a world with surveys and deeds and written records, it might have been settled in an afternoon by simply consulting a document. But Witchcombe had no such document, and so the matter went, as these things did, to the folk moot, a gathering of the village's free men held beneath an old oak that had served this exact purpose for longer than anyone could say. There is something worth understanding here about how order was actually kept in a world without courts in any modern sense, without written law readily available to the people it governed, without a sheriff or a magistrate close enough to matter for most disputes that arose. Justice in Hild's world operated largely through custom, through the collective memory of the community, and through a set of principles that had been passed down orally, with a precision that might surprise people who assume unwritten law must be vague or arbitrary. It was neither. Compensation for wrongs, whether a boundary dispute, a stolen animal, or something far more serious, was calculated according to a system with real specificity, weighing the severity of the offence, the status of those involved, and the particular circumstances at hand, all held not in a book but in the memory of the older men who sat in judgment, men whose authority rested entirely on the community's trust that they remembered the customs correctly and would apply them fairly. The boundary dispute, in the end, was settled not by punishment, but by a kind of negotiated memory, 3 of the oldest men in the village walking the disputed line together, recalling aloud where the stone had stood when each of them was young, cross-checking each other's recollection until something like consensus emerged. It was imperfect. It relied entirely on the good faith and reasonably intact memory of a handful of elderly men, and Hild had heard, more than once, of villages where such disputes turned bitter and lasted years. But it worked, more often than not, because the alternative, a world with no mechanism at all for resolving conflict short of violence, was something nobody wanted to live in, and the whole community understood that the folkmoot's authority depended on everyone continuing to treat its judgments as binding, even when they personally disagreed. I think what strikes me most about this system, when I really sit with it, is how much weight it placed on memory as a kind of civic infrastructure. In our own world, we tend to think of law as something written down, fixed, external to any particular person, capable of outlasting the people who made it. In Witchcombe, law lived nowhere except inside the minds of the people who knew it, which meant the death of a respected elder was not just a personal loss, but something closer to the burning of a small archive, an irreplaceable store of precedent and custom, gone in an afternoon. It is no wonder, thinking about it now, that villages prized their oldest members the way they did, not merely out of sentiment, but out of something closer to institutional necessity. The matter of the boundary stone was still being discussed, in the mild, repetitive way that village gossip works over such things, when the harvest itself arrived in earnest, and for 2 weeks the entire rhythm of Witchcombe bent around it, every able body in the fields from first light until the light gave out, cutting and binding and carrying, the whole village moving as something closer to a single organism than a collection of separate households. Hild worked alongside everyone else, her hands and forearms scored with the fine red lines that barley stubble left on bare skin, and in the evenings, when the work finally stopped, there was an exhaustion that was almost pleasant, the kind that made sleep come fast and dreamless. It was toward the close of the harvest, once the last of the grain was in, and a mood of genuine relief had settled over the village, that a feast was held at the hall of the local thing, a minor lord whose holdings included Witchcombe among several other small settlements, and whose hall, though modest by the standards of a proper king's court, was still the grandest structure most villagers would ever set foot inside. Hild and Alfric attended, as did most of the village, drawn by the promise of meat that most households rarely tasted in such quantity, and by the simple pleasure of an evening that asked nothing of anyone except to eat well and listen. There, that evening, Hild first heard the skop properly. A travelling poet and storyteller who moved between halls the way Ceolwulf moved between villages, trading not goods but stories, verses, the accumulated memory of a culture that had almost no other way of preserving itself. He sang first a long piece about the sea, half chant and half melody, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall, even without any effort that Hild could detect, the way some voices simply are built for rooms like that. And then, once the singing had settled the crowd into a particular kind of stillness, he told a story that Hild had heard fragments of before, but never in full, about events that had happened generations back, in the time of Hild's great-grandparents, concerning a king named Sinewulf, and a claimant to his throne named Sinherd. The story, as the scope told it that night, unfolded the way the best of these tales did, with a shape that felt almost inevitable once you heard it, though Hild knew perfectly well that real events rarely arranged themselves so neatly. Sinewulf, king of Wessex for many years, had been surprised at a small residence he kept for visiting a woman, caught there with only a handful of men around him by Sinherd, a rival with a grievance stretching back years, who had gathered his own followers in secret and moved against the king while he was at his most exposed. The king's few companions fought rather than surrender, and died rather than abandon him, and the king himself fell fighting before help could arrive. And then, in the strange symmetry these old stories often carried, the king's own retainers arrived the next morning, learnt what had happened, and were offered by Sinherd both money and land if they would simply accept him as their new lord and walk away. Every one of them refused. They chose, to a man, to attack a numerically superior force in an unwinnable fight, dying rather than accept a king whose claim to the throne rested on the killing of the lord they had sworn to serve. He let that sit in the hall for a moment, before adding the detail that always struck Hild the hardest, every time she thought about it afterward. One of the men outside had a kinsman inside Sinherd's camp, and was offered safe passage specifically because of that blood tie, a way out that cost him nothing and would have been entirely understandable to accept. He turned it down. He told his kinsman, or so the story went, that he loved no kinsman more than he loved his lord, and he died with the others rather than live having chosen differently. There is a version of that story that could be told as simple tragedy, a pointless slaughter born of stubborn pride on every side. But that was not how the hall received it that night, and it is not entirely how I receive it either, sitting with it now, centuries removed. What comes through underneath the violence is something about how a world without written law, without a strong central authority reaching into every corner of daily life, had to construct its stability from somewhere else entirely. It built it from loyalty, sworn person to person, taken with a seriousness that can look, from a distance, almost incomprehensible. Those men did not die because they lacked better options. They died because the entire structure holding their world together depended on loyalty meaning something absolute, and a version of that loyalty which could be traded away for land or safety was, to them, not really loyalty at all, and a world where oaths could be broken so easily was a world none of them wanted to live in badly enough to compromise. I am not sure I agree with the choice. I am fairly certain I would not have made it myself, but I find myself unable to dismiss it either, and I think that tension, admiration and discomfort sitting side by side is probably closer to how the story was meant to land than either feeling on its own. The hall exhaled after the story ended, the particular collective release that follows something heavy and well told, and the mood shifted, as it always did, toward lighter fare. This was when the riddling began, a tradition Hild had loved since childhood, and one that, I think, deserves far more attention than it usually gets when people picture this period. The scope, or sometimes anyone in the hall bold enough to try, would pose a riddle in verse, describing some ordinary object or creature through a kind of deliberately misleading, richly poetic language, and the rest of the hall would call out guesses until someone landed the answer, usually to general laughter and a round of mock outrage from whoever had composed it. That night the scope offered one describing something that moved without feet, that could destroy a hall or warm a hand, that a man might carry cupped in his palm one moment and flee from screaming the next. Fire, someone called almost immediately, and the scope nodded, mildly disappointed at how quickly it had landed, and tried a harder one, something about a creature born without life that gives life to others, that has neither soul nor hands and yet feeds the mouths of many. That one took longer, the hall really arguing over it, until a woman near the fire suggested bread, and after a pause the scope admitted it was close enough to count, though the riddle as he had learned it was properly meant for something slightly different, an egg perhaps, or dough rising, depending on which version of the verse you had been taught. I want to dwell on this for a moment, because I think riddling like this tells us something genuine about the intellectual life of a period too often flattened, in popular imagination, into pure grimness and survival. These were not simple people amusing themselves with simple games. The riddles that survive from roughly this era, preserved by chance in a single manuscript copied by monks, and now kept, of all places, in a cathedral library in Exeter, show a sophistication of wordplay, of double meaning, of genuine literary craft that would not embarrass a poet working in any later century. Some of the surviving riddles are frankly, cheerfully bawdy, playing on double meanings that made monks blush even as they copied them down for posterity, which tells you something reassuring about how much a sense of humour survives even the harshest of times. Others are meditations on faith, on suffering, on the strange dignity of ordinary tools and creatures, a plough, a swan, a bookworm eating its way through a manuscript without any idea of what it destroys. The people gathered in that hall were not dulled by hardship into some flattened, humourless version of humanity. They played with language the way people always have, delighting in cleverness for its own sake, in the small triumph of guessing correctly, in the shared laughter when a riddle's true, slightly rude meaning finally landed. Hild and Alfric walked home well after dark that night, the children half asleep between them, the sky above the lane thick with more stars than either of them would have thought to comment on, because a sky like that was simply the ordinary backdrop of every clear night in a world with no other light to compete against it. Autumn was settling in fully by then, the air carrying that particular sharpness that meant the warm months were properly over, and Hild found herself, as she often did on the walk home from any gathering, turning the evening over in her mind, the story of Cynewulf and Cinherd, the riddles, the warmth of the hall fire against the cold outside it. Winter came on slowly that year, the way it usually did, each week shaving a little more daylight off both ends, until the days felt more like brief pauses between long stretches of dark. It was during one of the shorter days, grey and unremarkable, that word reached Witchcombe of trouble along the coast, carried inland the way such news always travelled, mouth to mouth, gaining and losing detail with every retelling, until what finally reached the village was more rumour than report. Ships had been seen, a settlement 2 days' journey away, closer to the sea than Witchcombe would ever be, had lost stores and livestock to raiders who came ashore at dawn and were gone again before any organised response could be mounted. Nobody Hild knew personally had been harmed, as far as anyone could say for certain, though the story, by the time it reached her, had already picked up enough conflicting detail that separating fact from fear had become nearly impossible. What Witchcombe actually did with news like this is, I think, one of the more quietly impressive aspects of how ordinary communities in this period managed a threat they had no real way of preventing outright. There was no standing army to call on, no soldiers stationed anywhere near enough to matter. What existed instead was a system built almost entirely out of ordinary men doing double duty as farmers and as a kind of scattered part-time defence force, known collectively as the Fyrd, called together only when honestly needed, disbanded again the moment the danger passed, because a farm left untended for too long could do as much damage to a family as any raider might. Aelfric, like every free man of the district capable of bearing arms, was technically part of this system, and the news from the coast meant that within a day a rider had come through Witchcombe confirming what everyone already suspected, that the men of the village should keep their weapons close and be ready, though ready, in practice, mostly meant knowing where the nearest high ground was and agreeing on a signal. The signal itself was simple and had been for longer than anyone could say. A beacon, laid and ready on the hill above the village, to be lit the moment word came that trouble was moving inland rather than staying safely along the coast. It was a system built entirely on relayed observation, one hilltop signalling the next, a chain of small fires that could in theory carry a warning across a surprising distance far faster than any rider could travel. Hild had seen the beacon lit exactly once in her life before that winter, years earlier, and remembered mostly the strange, almost beautiful stillness of the entire village, standing outside their homes in the dark, watching a point of orange light on the hill and waiting to see whether more would follow it along the chain, or whether, as had happened that time, it would simply burn down alone, a false alarm or a threat that never came close enough to matter. That winter, the beacon was never lit at all. The trouble along the coast, whatever its true shape had been, did not move inland, and within a few weeks the story had softened into something closer to the ordinary background hum of danger that every community near enough to the coast simply learnt to live alongside, the way people learn to live with weather that occasionally turns violent without warning. I think it is worth saying plainly, because it is easy for the raids of this period to swallow the entire picture of what life was actually like, that most days, for most people, including people living far closer to the sea than Witchcombe, passed without any raid at all. Fear of it was real and constant in a low, background way, the way a person living somewhere prone to storms keeps half an ear on the wind without it ruling every hour of every day. But the raids themselves, terrible as they could be when they came, were not the texture of daily life. The texture of daily life was fields and animals and children learning to spin and old men arguing about boundary stones. The raids were the exception that everyone braced for, and that, most years, in most places, simply did not arrive. Hild found herself, in the weeks after the news came and went, thinking more than usual about that morning on the dunes as a girl, the low shapes on the water, her mother's hand gripping hers. She had still told no one, not even now, not even with the memory sitting so close to the surface. But one evening, with the children asleep and Aelfric mending a strap by the fire, she found herself speaking before she had entirely decided to, telling him, haltingly at first, and then with more ease than she expected, about the dunes, about the waiting, about the particular, specific quality of fear that comes not from something happening, but from the unbearable stretch of not yet knowing whether it will. Aelfric listened without interrupting, which was, she reflected afterward, exactly the right response, though she was not sure he had chosen it deliberately, rather than simply being the kind of man who listened that way to most things. When she finished, he did not offer reassurance exactly, did not tell her the fear was foolish, or that she need not have carried it so long alone. He only reached over and took her hand, the same steady grip he used on tools and animals and, she realized, on her, when the moment called for it, and said that he was glad she had told him, and that whatever came, if anything ever did come, they would face it together, rather than her carrying the weight of imagining it by herself. It was not a grand statement, he was not a man given to grand statements, but it settled something in her that had been unsettled, in one form or another, for over 20 years, and she found, in the weeks that followed, that the memory of the dunes came to her less often, and when it did, it carried less weight than it had before. The turning toward midwinter brought its own particular labour, different in character from the harvest, but no less demanding, and it settled over the household with a rhythm Hild had known her whole life and still, every year, found something to notice freshly within it. The pig that had been fattening in the small enclosure behind the house since spring was slaughtered in the customary way, a task Aelfric handled with the same brisk, practiced competence he brought to any necessary thing, and what followed over the next several days was less about the killing itself, which was over quickly, and everything about the enormous labour of making sure nothing of the animal went to waste. Meat was salted and packed into barrels. Fat was rendered down slowly over the fire into something that would see them through months of cooking. Even the bristles found their way into brushes, and the bladder, cleaned and dried, became a container that would hold lard or seeds through the coming year. There is a kind of respect in that thoroughness that I think is easy to overlook, a whole household organising itself around the principle that an animal's life should not be spent carelessly, that waste, in a world this close to the margin, was not simply wasteful, but something closer to a moral failure. Candles and rushlights occupied another stretch of those darkening weeks, another task that fell mostly to Hild and Ealhswith, dipping rushes that had been gathered from the margins of the mill pond months earlier, and dried through the summer, over and over into melted fat, building up layer after thin layer, until each one could hold a small, steady flame for perhaps half an hour before burning down. It was slow, repetitive work, done by firelight itself, which always struck Hild as faintly amusing, using the last hour of daylight and the fire's own glow to manufacture the small points of light that would carry them through the darkest months ahead. Ealhswith complained, as she always did, that her fingers ached from the repeated dipping, and Hild reminded her, as she always did in turn, that her own grandmother had done this exact task at this exact age, and her grandmother before that, back and back through a chain of hands neither of them could actually count, though the thought of it seemed to settle something in the girl every time it was offered, a sense of being one link in something considerably larger than herself. I find something quietly moving in this kind of labour, the sheer unglamorous persistence of it, the way an entire household's ability to see in the dark for months at a time depended on weeks of patient, repetitive, faintly tedious work undertaken well in advance, with no possibility of catching up later if you had put it off. There was no shop to visit if you ran short of candles in February. There was only what you had made, back in the shortening days of autumn, with your own hands, judged carefully enough to last exactly as long as the darkness demanded, and not run out before the light came back. It strikes me as a kind of discipline that has almost entirely vanished from how most of us live now, this necessity of thinking half a year ahead about something as basic as whether you would be able to see inside your own house after sundown. The ale, too, needed tending through these weeks, brewed from barley malted and dried earlier in the year, and Hild took a particular, quiet pride in this part of the household's work, because brewing, in a village like Witchcombe, was almost entirely the domain of women, passed mother to daughter, with the same careful, unwritten precision as spinning or weaving. A batch gone wrong meant more than a disappointing drink. Ale was, in a very real sense, safer to consume through much of the year than the water available to most households, and a family that brewed poorly or too little faced a genuine practical difficulty that went well beyond simple taste. Hild had learnt the craft from her own mother, who had learnt it from hers, each generation adjusting slightly for the particular water of wherever they happened to live, the particular grain available in a given year, small variations accumulating into something that, by the time it reached Hild, felt entirely her own even as it remained, in its bones, an inheritance. There was a particular evening, close enough to the solstice that the daylight had shrunk to something barely worth the name, when Hild stood alone for a few minutes in the small yard behind the house, checking on a batch of ale settling in its vessel, and found herself simply standing still in the cold, for longer than the task required, watching her own breath cloud in front of her in the last grey light. The animals shifted somewhere behind her in the byre, a soft companionable sound. Smoke rose thin and straight from the roof of the house, no wind at all to bend it. Somewhere down the lane a dog barked twice and fell silent. It was such an ordinary moment, nothing was happening in it at all, and yet she felt, standing there, a kind of settledness that she found herself wanting to hold on to a little longer than the cold really allowed. The particular, specific piece of a household prepared, as well as it could be prepared, for whatever the dark months ahead might bring. The feast that marked the turning of the year arrived a few days later, and it carried, as these things so often did in Hild's world, two names and two sets of customs folded together so completely that most people in the village would have struggled to say precisely where one ended and the other began. The church called it the birth of Christ, and Witchcombe's small wooden chapel, plain and cold and lit by exactly as many candles as the household could spare that day, held a service the villagers attended with genuine devotion, kneeling on packed earth floor strewn with fresh rushes for the occasion. But the same days carried older weight too, the simple ancient relief of having survived to the turning point, the moment when the days would, however slowly, however imperceptibly at first, begin to lengthen again. Osric, predictably, was the one who said it plainest, standing outside the chapel afterward in the cold, remarking to no one in particular that his grandfather's grandfather had marked this same week for reasons that had nothing to do with any church at all, and that he saw no contradiction in marking it now for both reasons at once. Evergreen boughs had been brought into the house, holly mostly, its berries a shock of red against the grey wood of the walls, a custom nobody could quite explain the origin of, and everyone observed anyway, because it had always been done, and the house looked undeniably more cheerful for it. A fire larger than usual burned through the darkest of the nights, fed deliberately, kept going long past the hour a household would normally have banked it down and gone to sleep, and there was a comfort in that alone, the simple decision to let light and warmth run a little more freely than strict economy would usually allow, as though the household itself were declaring, however quietly, that this particular darkness would not be allowed to win. Gifts, in the sense we would recognize the word now, were modest and few, but they existed, and Hild had spent stolen hours over the preceding weeks working on something small for each of her children, without either of them noticing, a carved wooden comb for eelers with, its teeth smoothed and evened with patience she had not entirely known she possessed, and for Bion, quietly arranged through a conversation with the smith whose forge the boy had been haunting all autumn, a small iron knife of his own, plain and sturdy, the kind of gift that told a 12-year-old boy, more clearly than words could have managed, that the adults around him had noticed what he wanted and had decided he was ready for a piece of it. Bion's face, when he understood what he was holding, was a thing Hild found herself thinking about for days afterward, that particular mixture of surprise and fierce, barely contained pride that belongs almost exclusively to children on the edge of no longer being children. Aelfric, watching from across the fire, caught Hild's eye and said nothing, but something passed between them in that look, the specific, wordless communication of two people who had discussed this decision quietly for weeks and had now watched it land exactly as they hoped it would. The apprenticeship with the smith, it turned out, had already been more or less settled between Aelfric and the smith himself over the preceding month, a decision they had kept from the children until the timing felt right, and the knife was, in its way, an announcement as much as a gift, a small, sharp piece of proof that the boy's fascination with fire and iron had been taken seriously by the people whose opinion mattered most to him. I think there is something worth sitting with in how quietly momentous a decision like that actually was, in a world without the layered systems of choice that later centuries would build. Bjorn's path, from that Yule onward, was largely set. He would spend his adolescent years learning the smith's craft, first as little more than an errand runner and bellows worker, gradually earning his way toward the forge itself, and by the time he reached full manhood, he would either be a smith himself, or he would not, and either outcome would shape the entire remaining architecture of his life, who he married, where he lived, what status he held in whatever village eventually claimed him. There was no trying a few different paths before committing. There was, mostly, one door, opened or not opened, and Aelfric and Hild had just opened it for their son, with a gift that must have felt, to the boy himself, like nothing more than a wonderful surprise. That night, after the children had finally been persuaded to sleep, worn out from the excitement and the unusually rich food, Hild and Aelfric sat by the fire a while longer than usual, neither of them in any particular hurry toward bed. Outside it had begun to snow, quietly, without wind, the kind of snow that Hild always found herself listening for, even though it made no sound at all, a stillness so complete it registered almost as its own kind of presence. Aelfric mentioned, apropos of very little, that he had heard from a man at the smith's forge that the young king in Wessex, still establishing himself, was said to be capable, in ways that reminded some of the older men of kings from further back, that there was talk, cautious and half-formed, of a kingdom that might someday hold together more firmly than the shifting patchwork Hild and Aelfric had known their whole lives. Neither of them could have known, sitting by that fire with snow falling silently outside, how much would actually change in the decades ahead, how the grandson of the very King Aelfric mentioned so casually that night would grow into a ruler remembered, centuries later, as one of the most consequential figures England ever produced, a man who would hold a fracturing kingdom together against pressures Hild and Aelfric's own generation could barely have imagined. That story belongs to another night, another fire, and I will not pull it into this one except to say that the world Hild lived in, for all its fragmentation, for all its uncertainty about which lord held power in which valley from one year to the next, was quietly, slowly assembling itself, one uneasy decade at a time, into something that would eventually be recognizable as a single country. Nobody living through any single year of that process could have seen it happening. It is only from a great distance, looking back, that the slow accumulation resolves into a shape at all. For now, though, in the small warm circle of firelight in a farmhouse in Witchcombe, none of that mattered very much. What mattered was the snow outside, and the fire holding steady, and a son who had gone to sleep clutching a knife he was almost surely too excited to actually rest with, and a daughter dreaming, probably, of the wooden comb now tucked carefully beside her under the blanket. Hild leaned her head against Aelfric's shoulder, feeling the particular tiredness that comes only at the end of a day spent entirely on other people's happiness, and watched the fire settle slowly down toward embers, in no hurry at all to move toward sleep herself, content, for this one evening, simply to sit inside the quiet. Deep winter settled over Witchcombe in the weeks that followed, the kind of cold that made every trip to the well or the byre a small negotiation with the body's own reluctance, and the household drew inward the way it always did this time of year, most of the daylight hours spent close to the fire, hands busy even when the body had nowhere in particular to go. It was on one of these nights, the wind finally picking up after days of eerie stillness, that a knock came at the door well past the hour anyone would normally expect a visitor, and Aelfric rose without hesitation, the particular unhesitating readiness of a man responding to something he understood immediately, even before he knew who stood on the other side. It was a stranger, a man perhaps 30 years old, half frozen, travelling alone on some errand he explained only in the vaguest terms. Something about kin further west he was trying to reach before the worst of the winter closed the roads entirely. He was not from anywhere near Witchcombe. Aelfric had never seen him before in his life, and by any reasonable modern instinct, a lone traveller appearing at your door after dark, offering only a partial account of himself, might have been met with real caution, perhaps even turned away. Aelfric ushered him inside without a second thought, sat him by the fire, and Hild had bread and the last of the ale in front of him within minutes, the whole household reorganizing itself around this stranger's comfort with a speed that, I think, tells you something important about how differently hospitality functioned in this world compared to how most of us think about it now. Hospitality, in Hild's world, was not simply a pleasant social nicety. It carried something closer to the weight of religious obligation, rooted in customs old enough that nobody could say precisely where they had originated, reinforced by both the older folk tradition and the newer Christian teaching that had layered itself on top, both of which agreed, for once without any real friction between them, that a stranger arriving at your door in genuine need was to be sheltered and fed, no questions asked beyond the basic courtesies, and that refusing such a request carried a kind of social and spiritual weight that most households simply would not risk. There were practical reasons for this too, of course. A world without inns in any meaningful sense, without any reliable institution a traveller could depend on, functioned only because ordinary households agreed, collectively and more or less universally, to extend this kind of shelter to strangers on the understanding that they themselves might someday be the stranger arriving cold and uncertain at someone else's door. The man ate quietly, warmed slowly, and eventually, prompted gently by Aelfric's easy, unhurried questions, told a little more of himself, enough to satisfy the household's curiosity without ever quite becoming a full account. He slept that night in the byre, near the animals, which was warmer than it sounds, and was gone again before full light, leaving nothing behind but a murmured thanks and, Hild noticed later, a small carved bead he had left on the table, not payment exactly, since payment was neither expected nor really the point, but a gesture, the kind of small unasked-for kindness that travellers of this era seem to understand as its own quiet language. Eon, watching all of this with the frank curiosity of a boy who had never really considered that hospitality might work any differently, asked his father afterward whether they would have taken the man in even if he had seemed less trustworthy, seemed in some way actually dangerous. Aelfric considered the question longer than Hild expected, and answered in the end that a man deeply showing violence at your door was a different matter entirely, that hospitality was never meant to require foolishness, But barring that, he said, you fed the stranger and asked your questions after, because the alternative, a world where every unfamiliar face was treated first with suspicion, was a harder and colder world than any of them wanted to live in, and because, he added, with the particular dry humour Hild loved in him, you never quite knew when you yourself might be the one standing cold at someone else's door. The rhythm of that winter continued much as winters always did, work narrowing to what the season allowed, a great deal of mending and small repair, tools sharpened, harnesses checked, the loom kept busy with wool spun through the autumn now finally becoming cloth under Hild's careful hands. It was slow work and companionable, done mostly in silence broken by conversation that wandered wherever it wanted to, and it was during one long quiet afternoon of exactly this kind that Osric, visiting as he so often did, told a story Hild had never heard in full before, about a man from a monastery some distance to the north, a herdsman by the name of Cundeman who had, by all report, been entirely unable to sing or compose verse his whole life, so much so that he would leave gatherings early whenever the harp was passed around, ashamed of his own inability to take his turn. Osric's story held that Caedmon had gone out one night to tend the animals as he often did, relieved to escape the harp's approach, and had fallen asleep in the stable, and had dreamed, or perhaps simply experienced, a figure standing over him asking him to sing. He protested, in the dream, that he could not, that this was exactly why he had left the hall in the first place, and the figure told him, gently but with a kind of unshakable certainty, that he could sing, and that he should sing about the beginning of created things. And Caedmon woke with verses in his mind, whole and complete, in his own English tongue, verses of real beauty about creation itself, and could not stop composing from that morning onward, going on to become, by the account passed down through the monasteries, one of the earliest poets of English verse whose work and story survived at all, a herdsman transformed, seemingly overnight, into something the monks themselves considered a gift touched by grace. I find myself drawn to this story every time I encounter it, not because I necessarily need to take the miraculous framing literally to find it moving, but because underneath the miracle sits something quietly true about how creativity and voice can arrive in people who have spent their whole lives certain they had none. Whatever actually happened to the historical Caedmon, whatever combination of genuine gift, sudden confidence, or something we would now describe in entirely different terms, the fact remains that a man who tended animals for a living, who had no education, no standing, no reason by any worldly measure to be remembered at all, became one of the very few voices from this period whose name and whose words survived the centuries, preserved carefully by monks who recognized something in his verse, worth the enormous labour of writing it down. Spring, when it finally came, arrived the way it always did in that part of England, not as any single dramatic morning, but as a slow accumulation of small signals that only became obvious once you had already half noticed a dozen of them, the ground softening underfoot, a particular bird returning to the hedge behind the house, the light stretching a little further into what had been, only weeks before, solid darkness by the time the evening meal was finished. With it came ploughing, the heaviest and most physically demanding stretch of the entire farming year, and for several weeks the household's whole existence bent around it, Alfric out with the ox and the plough from first light, Hild and the children managing everything else that kept a farm running in his absence. It was during one of these long spring days, walking a message to a neighbouring household on an errand for her mother, that Isleswith took a path that ran near the edge of what everyone in the district simply called the Old Place, a stretch of ground perhaps 2 miles from Witchcombe, where, beneath overgrown grass and centuries of accumulated soil, the low, regular outlines of what had once been a proper Roman town could still be traced if you knew where to look. Hild had walked past it herself countless times growing up, and had taken Isleswith there once or twice, mostly out of a vague sense that the girl should see it, though Hild herself could offer little explanation beyond what her own mother had told her, which was not much. Whatever this place had been, and it had been something substantial, judging by the scale of the foundations still faintly visible under the turf, a market town perhaps, or something larger, it had been abandoned for so long that not even Osric's memory reached back far enough to say with any confidence what had actually happened to it. The most common explanation offered around Witchcombe, held that the town had simply withered once the wider Roman system supporting it, the roads, the administration, the trade networks that had made a market town viable in the first place, collapsed, leaving behind a settlement that could no longer sustain the population or the function it had once served, until eventually the people who lived there drifted away to smaller, more self-sufficient farming settlements like Witchcombe itself, and the buildings, left untended, simply began the slow process of returning to the ground. This is, as far as anyone now understands it, roughly what actually happened across much of Roman Britain in the centuries following the withdrawal of Roman authority. Not a single dramatic collapse, but a long, uneven unwinding, towns shrinking gradually as the economic and administrative systems that had sustained urban life above a certain scale simply stopped functioning, one piece at a time, until what had been entirely substantial settlements, with proper masonry buildings and organized street plans and populations numbering in the thousands, dwindled to nothing, or to something so small and so changed in character that it barely resembled a town at all anymore. It is a strange thing to stand in a field, as Ealhswith did that spring afternoon, and know, however imprecisely, that beneath your feet lay the actual physical remains of a way of life that had once seemed as permanent and unshakable to the people living it as anything in Witchcombe seemed to Hild. Ealhswith came home that evening full of questions Hild could not fully answer, about who had lived there, what they had eaten, whether they had spoken the same tongue Witchcombe spoke now, or something else entirely, and Hild found herself, not for the first time, wishing she had better answers to give her daughter, wishing that the world held some place, some person, some book even, that could tell the girl with any real confidence what her own land had looked like 400 years earlier. It did not for people like them. What existed instead was speculation, patched together from half-remembered fragments, and the physical evidence still visible in the ground, and Hild found that she did not mind admitting this to her daughter, telling her plainly that nobody really knew, that some questions simply did not have answers anyone alive could give, and that this itself was worth sitting with rather than rushing past. The ploughing, meanwhile, brought its own reminders of how a household like theirs actually sat within the larger structure of who owned what and who owed what to whom. Aelfric was a freeman, which mattered enormously, though the word itself, spoken so simply, obscured a great deal of texture underneath it. He owned no land outright, in any sense a later century would recognize, but he held his 6 acres through a customary arrangement with the local thing that was secure enough, respected enough, passed down carefully enough through his own family before him, that in practice it functioned very much like ownership, so long as the customary dues were paid and the obligations honoured. Below him, socially, existed people whose position was considerably less secure, unfree labourers attached to the Thegan's own hall lands, men and women whose lives were bound to service in ways Aelfric's was not, who could be, and sometimes were, bought and sold along with the land they worked, a reality of this period that sits uncomfortably against any romantic image of a simple, egalitarian rural world. Hild knew several of these people by name, had worked alongside some of them at harvest time, when every hand in the district turned out together regardless of status, and the relationship between free and unfree in a village like Witchcombe's wider district was neither the total, dehumanizing brutality that word sometimes conjures in later imagination, nor anything approaching genuine equality. It was its own particular uneven thing, shaped by proximity and shared labour and the small daily humanity that tends to assert itself even within unjust structures, and Hild, without ever having the language to articulate it as a system, understood perfectly well that her own family's freedom, modest as it was, sat on one side of a line that mattered enormously to the people living on the other side of it, however little that line changed the actual texture of a shared afternoon spent binding sheaves together under the same sun. Years have a way of folding into each other faster than anyone living through them quite notices at the time, and it was nearly 3 winters later, with Beorn now well into his apprenticeship and spending most of his days at the smith's forge rather than underfoot at home, that Hild found herself one evening plainly startled by how much had shifted without any single dramatic moment marking the change. Beorn had grown taller than his father by then, broad through the shoulders in the particular way that came from years of working bellows and hammer, and there was a settledness to him now, a competence, that made it strange for Hild to remember the boy who had once traced letters on a stone by the mill pond, asking questions nobody could answer. Ealhswith, for her part, had become sincerely skilled at the loom, producing cloth fine enough that Hild had begun, quietly, to think about what kind of match the girl might eventually make, a consideration that carried real weight in a world where a young woman's practical skills, her ability to spin and weave and manage a household's provisions through a hard winter, mattered enormously to her prospects and to the family she would eventually join. Ealhswith herself seemed only vaguely aware of these calculations happening around her, absorbed instead in the simple, genuine pleasure of watching thread become cloth under her own increasingly confident hands, humming to herself at the loom in a way that made Hild smile every time she caught it. It was around this time that Ceolwulf passed through the village again, older now, his beard gone properly grey, though his manner remained exactly as it had always been, watchful and slightly weary and quietly pleased, underneath it, to be recognised and welcomed rather than treated as a stranger. He brought news along with his goods, as he always did, and some of it concerned the coast more directly than Hild entirely liked to hear, though she found, listening to it now, that the old sharp fear had settled into something calmer, more manageable, closer to simple weariness than the visceral panic the memory of the dunes had once carried. The raiding, Ceolwulf explained over the fire one evening, had changed character somewhat in recent years, at least according to what he pieced together travelling as widely as he did. Where once the ships had come mostly for a season, striking quickly and departing before winter closed the sea routes, there was talk now, still uncertain, still more rumour than settled fact, of parties choosing to stay through the cold months in certain places, wintering over on English soil rather than returning home, a shift that troubled the men who governed such things far more than a single season's raid ever had, because a raiding party that left in autumn was a wound that could heal. A presence that stayed was something else entirely, the beginning, perhaps, of something that would not simply pass. Hild listened to this with the particular attention of someone weighing a fear she had learned, slowly and with real effort, to hold at arm's length rather than let it consume her, and found that she could do so now in a way that would not have been possible in her own girlhood on those dunes. She was not naive about what the news meant, but she had also lived long enough by then to understand that the world held danger in every direction if you looked for it closely enough, that a bad harvest could starve a family as surely as any raider, that fever could take someone in a week that no army had touched in years, and that the only sane way to live inside a world this uncertain was to do the work in front of you, love the people beside you, and let the larger fears sit where they belonged, acknowledged but not allowed to govern every waking hour. Wilfrid, whom Ælfric visited again that same year, over a matter of a strained back that would not ease on its own, mentioned something in passing that stayed with Hild longer than she expected, once Ælfric relayed it to her. The monastery had received word, through the slow, uncertain channels that connected religious houses to each other across England, of raids much further north, striking places whose holy houses had stood, in some cases, for well over a century, undefended in any meaningful sense because nobody had ever needed to defend a monastery before, these being places set apart by common understanding as places of peace. Wilfrid had spoken of it, Ælfric said, with a kind of quiet grief that went beyond simple concern for property, a grief for something harder to name, the sense that an old, assumed safety, the safety of sacred ground itself, could no longer be entirely trusted the way it once had been, and that this loss, intangible as it was, might in the end matter more than whatever material goods any single raid actually carried away. I think this detail captures something true about how the raids of this period actually registered in the minds of people living through them. Beyond the immediate physical danger, it was not only about lost goods or lost lives, terrible as those losses plainly were. It was about a slow erosion of certain assumptions that an entire culture had built its sense of order around, the assumption that holy places were safe places, that the church's protection carried weight even against armed men, that some things, by common agreement across an otherwise fractured and uncertain world, simply were not done. Watching those assumptions crack, one raided monastery at a time meant watching something intangible and important come apart alongside the tangible losses, and it is perhaps this, more than any single raid, that explains why this period left behind the particular flavour of anxious, watchful memory that it did in the writings of the monks who survived to record any of it at all. But Witchcombe itself, through all of this, continued much as it always had. The fields were ploughed and sown and harvested, the ale was brewed, the loom clacked steadily through the winter months, and Bjorn's hammer rang out from the smith's forge, in a rhythm the whole village had come to find almost soothing in its familiarity, a sound that meant, simply, that the ordinary business of living continued, whatever news arrived from further off. This, I think, is worth remembering whenever the larger, darker currents of a historical period threaten to swallow the whole picture. Most days, for most people, most of the time, life continued in its ordinary textures, meals cooked and children raised, and small pleasures taken where they could be found, even in the shadow of real and legitimate fear. The fear was real. So was the ordinary, stubborn continuation of everything around it. It was in the early summer of that same year that a wedding took place in Witchcombe, not Ealhswith's. She was still too young for that particular chapter, but that of a young woman named Steinberg, who lived 2 households down the lane, a match that had been talked about, in the low, constant way village matches always were, for the better part of a year before it finally happened. Hild had known Steinberg since the girl was small, had watched her grow into the kind of steady, capable young woman that families in this world valued above almost any other quality, and the wedding itself, when it finally arrived, gave Hild the chance to explain to Ealhswith, who watched the proceedings with the frank fascination of a girl beginning to understand that this particular future awaited her too, exactly how such things actually worked. Marriage in Hild's world was not primarily a matter of romantic feeling, though affection existed too, and mattered, and was hoped for, sometimes fervently, by the people involved. It was, first and fundamentally, an economic and social arrangement between 2 families, negotiated with a seriousness that could look, to later eyes, almost businesslike, though it rarely felt that way to the people living inside it. The groom's family, in Steinberg's case a modestly prosperous farming household from a neighbouring settlement, provided what was known as the bride price, goods or livestock given to the bride's own family in recognition of what her labour and her presence had been worth to that household, and what the marriage would now cost them by taking her away. And the morning after the wedding itself, custom demanded something else entirely, a gift given directly to the bride by her new husband, hers alone, entirely outside her husband's control, a kind of guaranteed provision that would remain hers even if the marriage later dissolved through death or, more rarely, separation. Hild explained this to Ealhswith carefully, because she thought it mattered that her daughter understand, early, that this gift represented something more than sentiment. It was, in its way, a form of protection built into the very structure of marriage itself, an acknowledgement, however imperfect, that a wife's security should not depend entirely on her husband's continued goodwill or continued life. Hild's own such gift, given to her by Alfric the morning after their own wedding 17 years earlier, was a small piece of land at the edge of his holding that she had, in the years since, quietly used to grow herbs and flax of her own, produce she sold or traded entirely on her own account, a modest but wholly independent thread of economic standing that belonged to her and to no one else, not even her husband, not by custom and not by law, as either of them understood it. The wedding feast itself was a joyful, noisy affair, the whole village turning out with the particular collective relief that any genuine celebration brought to lives otherwise governed so heavily by labour and necessity. There was music, the same Scop or one very like him, singing something lighter than the tale of Sinewulf, a piece about a journey home that Hild had heard many times before and never tired of. There was more meat on the table than most households saw outside of major feasts, contributed collectively by families across the village according to an unspoken but well-understood arrangement, everyone giving what they could toward the shared occasion, because a wedding, like a harvest, belonged in some sense to the whole community rather than to a single household alone. Ealhswith, watching Steinberg dance, actually dance, something Hild herself still enjoyed on occasions like this despite what she considered her advancing years, asked her mother quietly whether she herself would have a say in who she eventually married, or whether the whole matter would simply be arranged around her the way it seemed to have been arranged around Steinberg. Hild considered the question honestly before answering, because she did not want to give her daughter a false picture in either direction. The families would negotiate, she said, that much was true and would not change, but a father with any sense, and she believed Aelfric had sense enough, would not force a match his daughter thoroughly could not abide, because a marriage built on real misery served nobody well, least of all the family hoping to gain a useful, willing daughter-in-law or son-in-law from the arrangement. There was room, in other words, for a daughter's voice, even within a system that did not formally require anyone to ask for it, and Hild found herself hoping, as she said this, that it would prove true when the time actually came for Ealhswith herself. The night ended late, later than most nights in Witchcombe ever ran, the fire at the Thegians' hall burning down slowly while children fell asleep against whichever adult happened to be nearest, and Hild and Aelfric walked home under a sky just beginning to show the faint grey of an early summer dawn, Ealhswith half asleep between them, murmuring something about the dancing that neither of her parents quite caught. It had been, Hild reflected, watching her breath cloud faintly in the cool pre-dawn air, exactly the kind of evening that made the harder stretches of the year worth enduring. A whole village gathered together in genuine, uncomplicated happiness, at least for one night, before the ordinary demands of the season reasserted themselves the following morning. Coin was a strange half-present thing in Witchcombe's economy, and it was around this time, watching Steinberg's new husband settle a small debt with the smith over some repaired farm tool, that Hild found herself explaining to Ealhswith how money actually moved, or mostly did not move, through a world like theirs. Silver coins existed, small thin pennies struck in the workshops of kings and, occasionally, of the church, and every household in the district had probably handled a few of them at some point in a given year. But coin was not the primary language most transactions in Witchcombe were conducted in. Most of daily life ran on barter, direct and immediate, a measure of grain traded for a mended tool, a day's labour at harvest exchanged for a share of the crop, a length of woven cloth traded to the smith against future work, the whole village economy operating as an intricate, mostly unwritten web of mutual obligation that everyone involved simply carried in memory, much the way the Folkmoot carried its lore. Its use mattered most at the edges of this web, in transactions with strangers, with traders like Ceolwulf who could not be expected to want a share of someone else's harvest in exchange for salt, or in the larger payments owed to lords and to the church, tithes and dues that were sometimes rendered in produce directly, and sometimes, increasingly, expected in coin, a shift that put real pressure on households that had little occasion, in the normal course of their year, to actually hold silver in their hands. Aelfric kept a small store of coin, not much, hidden in a spot Hild suspected every member of the household actually knew about, despite the pretense of secrecy, set aside specifically against the years when dues could not easily be paid any other way, or against some genuine emergency that barter alone could not solve quickly enough. It struck Hild, explaining all this to her daughter, how strange it would seem to someone from an authentically different world, a world with proper markets and merchants and coin flowing freely through every transaction, to see how thin and occasional actual money was in the daily life of a farming household like theirs, and yet the system worked, had worked for generations, precisely because it did not depend on coin, because a community small enough for everyone to know everyone else's situation could run almost entirely on trust and memory, and the simple, durable understanding that favours given would eventually be returned in some form, sooner or later, in whatever coin the situation actually called for, whether that coin was silver or grain or labour or, sometimes, simply the quiet social credit of having been the kind of neighbour people could rely on. That autumn, the leaves just beginning to turn along the lane, Osric died. He had been failing for some months by then, his memory, ironically, the very faculty the whole village depended on him for, beginning to slip in small, sad ways that everyone noticed and nobody mentioned aloud, forgetting names he had known his whole life, repeating stories within the same conversation without seeming to notice he had already told them. His death itself, when it came, was quiet, in his sleep, in the small house he had lived in alone since his wife's death many years before Hild had even come to the village, and the news moved through Witchingham the way all news moved, mouth to mouth, arriving at Hild's door by mid-morning, carried by a neighbour's daughter who delivered it with the particular careful gentleness children use when repeating something they sense is important, without fully understanding why. Hild found the news hit her harder than she expected. She had known, of course, that Osric would not live forever, that he had already outlived most people's expectations for a man of his years, but there is a difference between knowing something in the abstract and feeling its actual weight arrive, and she found herself, that afternoon, setting down whatever task had been in front of her and simply sitting for a while, thinking about the particular texture of a world with one fewer person in it who remembered where the boundary stones had originally stood, one fewer voice who could tell you, with real authority, which years had brought good harvests and which had not, going back further than anyone else living could match. The funeral, held 2 days later, was an actually communal affair, the whole village turning out the way it had for Steinberg's wedding, though the mood naturally ran in the opposite direction entirely. The priest spoke the proper words, and afterward, at the small gathering held at Osric's own house, it was the villagers themselves who spoke longest, each offering some fragment of memory, some story involving the old man, building up between them, collectively, something that no single person's memory alone could have produced, a portrait assembled, the same way the folkmoot assembled its judgments, through the pooled recollection of everyone present. I think this is worth dwelling on, this particular way that a community without written records handled the death of someone who had functioned, in his own quiet way, as a kind of living archive. There was real anxiety underneath the grief, spoken by no one directly, but felt by everyone in the room, about what exactly had been lost along with Osric himself, which specific pieces of the village's shared memory had gone into the ground with him, and would now have to be reconstructed, imperfectly, from whatever fragments other people happened to have picked up over the years. It is a fragility that a literate world simply does not experience in the same way. We can lose a person we love terribly, and grieve that loss with everything grief demands, without also losing, in the same moment, some specific and irreplaceable body of practical knowledge that existed nowhere else. Witchcombe, in the autumn Osric died, lost both at once, and everyone gathered in that small house seemed to understand, without needing it said aloud, that this double loss was part of what made the grief particularly heavy that year. Bjorn completed his apprenticeship not long after, in the following spring, a milestone marked less by any single ceremony than by a gradual mutual recognition between himself and the smith who had trained him that he had become clearly capable in his own right. He began taking on work of his own soon after, small jobs at first, mending tools and shoeing the occasional horse, building slowly toward the kind of reputation that would in time let him establish something closer to his own independent trade. Watching her son work the forge on an errand she had invented mostly as an excuse to see him at it, Hild found herself struck by how completely he had grown into a version of himself that the boy tracing letters on a stone by the mill pond could not have imagined, and yet how clearly, underneath the new competence and the broadened shoulders, he remained recognizably himself, still asking the occasional question nobody could fully answer, still turning problems over with a patience that had simply found, in ironwork, a proper outlet at last. There was a particular knowledge that lived almost entirely with the women of Witchcombe, past the same unwritten way as spinning and brewing, concerning which plants healed and which harmed, and Hild had spent years absorbing it from her own mother and from other women in the village, the way you absorb anything taught more through repetition and observation than through any formal lesson. She knew, by the time Ealizabeth was old enough to begin learning it herself, an extraordinary amount of practical botany that she would never have described using that word, knowledge of yarrow for stopping a wound's bleeding, of feverfew for the specific throbbing headaches that sometimes plagued Ealifric after long days in strong sun, of the particular preparation of dried elderflower that eased a chest cold, and of a dozen other remedies, each tied to a specific plant, a specific preparation, a specific dose, all of it held entirely in memory, and passed hand to hand exactly the way the folkmoot's law had been. Wilfrid, on one of the family's visits to the monastery, had once shown Alfric something Hild found herself thinking about long afterward, a leech book, one of the great collected volumes of medical knowledge the monasteries maintained, filled with remedies drawn from a mixture of classical medical writing that had survived from the Roman world, folk knowledge gathered from across England, and observations the monks themselves had made and recorded over generations of tending the sick. Ælfric had described it to Hild in some detail, the sheer scale of it, remedy after remedy written out in careful hand, organised by ailment, some clearly drawn from genuine tested experience, and others carrying instructions that sounded, even to Ælfric's untrained ear, closer to charm and ritual than to anything resembling medicine as either of them would define the word. What struck Hild most hearing this was how much of what filled that carefully guarded book she herself already knew, unwritten, carried in nothing but memory and habit. The written leech book and the unwritten knowledge she carried in her own head were not, in truth, two entirely separate systems. They were closer to two different vessels, holding a great deal of the same accumulated human experience, one preserved behind monastery walls in a form that could theoretically outlast any single lifetime, and one preserved instead in the fragile, living memory of women like herself, vulnerable to being lost entirely the moment a mother failed to pass it fully to her daughter, or a daughter failed to listen closely enough to receive it. This, I think, is one of the truly striking aspects of medical practice in this period, easy to miss if you assume, as people sometimes do, that a world without formal medical training must have been a world of pure superstition and guesswork. There was superstition, plenty of it, remedies and charms that carried no real medical value by any standard we would now recognize, mixed in unevenly alongside really effective treatments discovered and refined through long, careful, empirical observation, generation after generation noticing which remedy actually eased a symptom and which did not, and quietly discarding the ones that failed while keeping and refining the ones that worked. It was not a scientific method in the formal sense the word would later come to mean, but it operated, in its slow, patient, trial-and-error way, on principles not entirely dissimilar, and it produced over centuries a body of practical knowledge that later medicine would sometimes rediscover, sometimes dismiss too quickly, and sometimes, quietly, simply absorb without much credit given to where it had originally come from. Ealhswith, by this point nearly 14 and increasingly capable in every domain a young woman of her station was expected to master, had begun to draw the attention of a young man from a neighbouring settlement, the second son of a moderately prosperous farming family, whose interest first became apparent through the entirely unsubtle method of finding excuses to be present whenever Ealhswith's family had any business in his village. Hild watched this unfold with a particular mixture of amusement and quiet vigilance that mothers seem to carry across every century, noting the young man's manners, his evident industry, the way he spoke to Ealhswith directly rather than only to her parents, which Hild took, rightly or wrongly, as a promising sign about the kind of husband he might eventually make. Nothing was settled yet, and would not be for at least another year or two, this being a courtship still in its earliest, most tentative stages, conducted almost entirely through brief exchanges at shared gatherings, and the occasional message carried by a mutual acquaintance, rather than anything resembling private time alone together, which would not have been considered proper at this stage regardless. But Hild found herself watching her daughter's careful, half-hidden pleasure at the young man's attention, thinking back to her own courtship with Ælfric, 17 years distant now, and yet somehow still vivid in certain details, the particular nervous energy of not yet knowing whether an arrangement being quietly discussed by two sets of parents would actually suit the two people it most concerned. She had been lucky, she reflected, watching her daughter. Not every match arranged with careful economic sense turned out to also suit the two people living inside it, and Hild had seen enough marriages in her years to know that some settled into something closer to functional partnership than genuine warmth, workable, respectable, and quietly lacking whatever it was that made her own marriage to Ælfric feel, even now, after 17 years and 2 grown children, like something closer to a genuine friendship than a mere arrangement. She hoped, watching Ælfric, that her daughter would be equally lucky, and found herself, in odd private moments, offering something close to a prayer on the matter, directed vaguely toward whichever combination of old custom and new faith seemed most likely to be listening. I want to step back for a moment here, because I think there is something worth saying plainly about the name this whole period eventually came to carry, the Dark Ages, a phrase Hild herself would never have heard and would not have understood if you had somehow explained it to her, since nobody living inside a period of history ever experiences it as an age of anything in particular. It is only afterward, from a distance measured in centuries, that anyone starts sorting the past into ages at all, and the label itself, dark, tells you rather more about the people who coined it, writers of later centuries looking back and finding the gap between Roman civilization and their own supposedly more enlightened present frustratingly thin on the kind of evidence they were used to working with, than it tells you about what it actually felt like to live inside the world Hild inhabited. It is true, and worth saying honestly, that this period left behind less written record than either the world that came before it or the world that came after, and that gap in the record is real and does shape, unavoidably, how much we can actually know about the daily texture of lives like Hild's. But absence of record is not the same thing as absence of light, and I think the phrase has done a genuine disservice to how people imagine this stretch of centuries, conjuring images of universal ignorance and grinding misery that simply do not match what evidence does survive. The people of Witchcombe, as I have tried to show you tonight, were not dulled or diminished by the thinness of their written record. They composed riddles clever enough to still make a reader smile 1100 years later. They maintained systems of law and memory sophisticated enough to hold a community together for generations without a single written statute. They preserved, in places like Wilfrid's monastery, threads of classical learning that later centuries would depend on entirely, threads that could easily have snapped and vanished forever if a relatively small number of dedicated, quietly stubborn people had not spent their lives protecting them. What strikes me most thinking about all of this is how much genuine continuity actually ran underneath the apparent rupture. Rome fell, in the sense that its administrative structures in Britain collapsed and were not replaced by anything resembling them for a very long time. But Latin survived, preserved carefully within the Church, studied by monks like Wilfrid, who could read texts written centuries before their own birth. Roman roads survived too, in fragmented, overgrown form, still shaping how people like Hild's family understood the landscape around them, even generations after anyone remembered who had built them or why. And the deepest continuities of all, the practical knowledge of how to grow food, weave cloth, brew ale, heal a wound, settle a dispute, raise a family, these never broke at all. They simply continued, quietly, in households like Hild's, passed hand to hand and voice to voice across a gap in the written record that later historians would eventually come to call dark, without ever quite meaning that the people living through it experienced their own lives that way. There is another thread worth pulling on here too, one that only becomes visible looking backward across a span of time no single person living inside it could have perceived. The fractured, uncertain political world Hild and Ælfric inhabited, the shifting patchwork of small kingdoms, the loyalty that could change hands with a change of ruler 2 valleys over, was not, it turns out, a permanent condition. It was a phase, one stage in a slow, halting, often violent process that would eventually, over the following century and beyond, produce something recognizable as a single kingdom of England, forged under real pressure, not least the pressure of the very raids that had haunted Hild's own girlhood on those dunes, pressure that pushed the separate kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia and the others toward forms of cooperation and eventual unification that none of them had sought or particularly wanted for their own sake, but that circumstance, in the end, more or less required of them. Hild would not live to see the fullest expression of that unification. Neither, most likely, would her children, though Beorn's own children, or their children after them, might well grow up in a world meaningfully more consolidated, more centrally governed than the one Witchcombe knew in Hild's own lifetime. This is, I think, one of the honestly humbling aspects of thinking carefully about any period of history, the recognition that the people living through the slow accumulation of change that later gets summarized in a single sentence, a kingdom was forged, experienced that same process as an unbroken, often confusing, often frightening present, one uncertain year following another, with no way of knowing which particular uncertainty would eventually resolve into the shape historians would later trace so confidently backward from a position of hindsight Hild herself could never have occupied. I find something quietly comforting in that thought, actually, turning it over now the way I imagine Hild might have turned it over on a similarly quiet evening. She could not see the shape her own moment in history would eventually take. None of us, living inside our own present, ever really can. What she could do, what she did do, every single day of her life in that small farmhouse in Witchcombe, was tend to what was actually in front of her: the fields, the children, the fire, the neighbours, the small accumulated acts of care and competence and stubborn continuation that, added together across countless households like hers, across countless years like the ones we have spent tonight moving through, eventually became something large enough to be called history at all. Autumn brought with it a particular kind of labour that Hild had always privately preferred to almost any other stretch of the farming year, the slow, unhurried work of gathering what the woods and hedgerows offered freely, without any of the back-breaking urgency that harvest itself demanded. She took Aylesworth with her most years on these expeditions, the two of them setting out with baskets in the cool early morning, moving along the fringes of the woodland that bordered the village's cultivated fields, gathering hazelnuts still in their green husks, the last of the blackberries gone soft and dark with the season, and, if they were fortunate and knew exactly where to look, the particular small mushrooms that grew each year in almost the same patches of ground, a knowledge so specific and so carefully guarded within families that Hild had inherited the location of certain patches from her own mother, the way another family might inherit land. There was danger woven through this pleasure too, of course, the same knowledge that told you which mushroom fed a family safely through a lean week, also carrying, always, the awareness of exactly which similar-looking growth could kill within a day, if mistaken for its safer cousin, and Hild taught eels with this distinction, with a seriousness that stood out against the otherwise relaxed, almost meditative quality of the mornings they spent gathering together. "Get this wrong," she told her daughter more than once, not to frighten her but because the lesson deeply mattered, and there is no remedy Wilfrid himself could offer that would undo it. Eelswith absorbed the warning the way she absorbed most things her mother taught her, with a seriousness that belied her years, and by the time she was old enough to gather alone, she could identify, with real confidence, every edible growth in the woods around Witchcombe, and, just as importantly, every dangerous one that might be mistaken for it. Wild honey, when they were lucky enough to locate a hollow tree holding a colony, represented a different kind of prize entirely, sweeter than anything else available to a household like theirs, and gathering it required a particular combination of patience and nerve that Aelfric handled more often than Hild, smoking the bees calm before reaching carefully into the hollow to remove a portion of comb, always leaving enough behind that the colony would survive to produce again the following year, a restraint that struck Aylesworth, the first time she watched her father do it, as almost unbearably difficult, taking only part of something so obviously desirable when more sat right there for the taking. Aelfric had explained it to her the way his own father had explained it to him, that a colony robbed too greedily this year would give you nothing at all the year after, and that patience, in this as in most things, tended to reward itself over time in ways that greed simply could not match. The dyeing of wool, which occupied a good deal of the household's attention once the wettest part of autumn set in and outdoor work slowed, offered Hild one of her few genuine opportunities for something like artistic expression, though she would never have used that word for it herself. The most common colour achieved in Witchcombe, a soft, unremarkable brown or grey, required no dye at all, simply the natural colour of the fleece itself, and most everyday clothing in the village carried this plain, undyed quality that made anyone wearing entirely coloured cloth stand out immediately, a visible marker of at least modest prosperity or particular occasion. Woad, grown in small quantities in a corner of the garden Hild tended herself, produced a blue that ranged from pale and washed out to something startlingly deep and rich depending on how many times the wool passed through the dye bath, a process involving a fermentation so specific in its timing and its smell that Hild's neighbours downwind on dying days had long since learnt to simply accept the odour as a temporary cost of living near a household that valued good colour. Madder root, harder to come by and more precious, produced a red that Hild reserved for special occasions, a strip of trim on a good tunic, a ribbon for Ilswith's hair on feast days, never enough of it available or affordable to dye an entire garment, and she found herself working with it, thinking about how differently colour functioned in her world compared to how she imagined it might function somewhere with easier access to trade goods, somewhere closer to a proper market town, where perhaps a family could simply buy cloth already dyed in whatever shade they fancied, rather than growing and fermenting and boiling their own small, precious quantities across an entire season's patient labour. I find something plainly lovely in imagining this. Honestly, the particular texture of a world where colour itself represented real, embodied labour, where a strip of red trim on a tunic told you something true and specific about the hours a household had spent coaxing that shade out of a root grown in their own garden, rather than simply representing a purchase made without a second thought. It changes what beauty means, I think, when beauty this costly to produce becomes, by necessity, something used sparingly, treasured rather than taken for granted. And I suspect Hild herself, watching Aylesworth turn a length of madder-dyed ribbon over in her hands with obvious delight, understood this instinctively in a way that required no explanation at all. Aylesworth's own wedding came 2 years after that, when she had turned 16, to the young man who had first caught her attention with his unsubtle habit of finding reasons to linger near her family whenever their business brought them into his village. His name was Wigmund, and he had grown, over the years of their slow, carefully chaperoned courtship, into exactly the kind of steady, capable young man Hild had hoped for, that first evening she had watched him watching her daughter across a shared gathering. The negotiations between the two families had taken the better part of a year to settle properly, the bride price discussed and agreed, the mourning gift Wigmund would provide arranged in careful detail, and by the time the wedding itself finally arrived, both families had long since moved past any lingering formality into something closer to genuine warmth, two households effectively becoming one through the slow, patient work that any real alliance requires. Hild found herself, on the morning of the wedding itself, surprised by the particular weight of watching her daughter dressed and prepared for a life that would now unfold mostly outside Witchcombe's boundaries, in Wigmund's own village, close enough for regular visits but far enough that Aylesworth's daily presence, the sound of her at the loom, her particular way of humming under her breath while she worked, would no longer be part of the ordinary texture of Hild's own days. She helped her daughter dress with hands that were steadier than she expected them to be, given how unsteady she felt inside, and found herself, in a quiet moment before the ceremony properly began, simply holding Aylesworth's face in both hands for a long moment, saying nothing at all, because there was nothing that needed saying that the two of them did not already understand between them. The years that followed brought their own gentle rhythm of change, the kind that accumulates so gradually a person living through it barely notices the shape it is taking until, quite suddenly, they look up and realize how much has shifted. Bjorn married 2 years after his sister, a young woman from a village slightly further along the river, whose own father worked as a wheelwright, a match that suited both families well, and that produced, within the first year, a son whose birth Hild attended as both grandmother and, in a role she had not entirely expected to grow into so naturally, as a woman whose accumulated knowledge of healing and birthing made her presence sincerely valuable in the room, rather than merely sentimental. Holding her first grandchild, a boy they named after Alfric's own long-dead father, Hild found herself struck by a particular, almost dizzying sense of continuation, the awareness that this small red-faced, furiously crying creature represented not simply a new beginning, but the latest link in a chain stretching back further than she could trace with any confidence, back through her own mother and grandmother, back, presumably, though she had no way of knowing the specifics, through generations who had lived and worked this same stretch of England long before the Romans ever built the road that now lay crumbling and half forgotten 2 miles from the village. He would grow up, this small boy, in a world Hild could not fully predict, shaped by pressures and changes she had only begun to glimpse the outline of. The slow consolidation of separate kingdoms into something larger, the uncertain, ongoing question of whether the raids that had shadowed her own girlhood would intensify or ease, whether the fragile threads of learning kept alive in places like Wilfrid's monastery would survive and grow, or continue their long precarious struggle simply to avoid vanishing altogether. She could not know any of it, but holding him that first evening, feeling the specific fierce weight of a newborn's grip around her finger, she found that the not knowing troubled her less than she might have expected. She had lived her own life, after all, inside exactly this same uncertainty, one season following another, 1 year's harvest uncertain until it was actually gathered, one piece of news from the coast never quite resolved into something you could plan around with any confidence. And she had built, inside that uncertainty, a life wholly worth living, full of real warmth and real competence and real, hard-won peace, and she found herself hoping, watching her grandson's small chest rise and fall against Bion's careful hands, that he would manage the same, whatever shape the larger world eventually took around him. Ilswith's own children arrived in the years that followed, a daughter first, and then, 2 years later, a son, and Hild found herself making the journey to Wigmund's village more often than she had anticipated in the early, uncertain months after the wedding, welcomed each time with a warmth that told her, more clearly than any words could have, that her daughter's marriage had settled into exactly the kind of genuine partnership Hild had hoped for that anxious morning years earlier. Watching Ilswith with her own small daughter, teaching her, even at an age that seemed impossibly young for it, the first careful movements of a drop spindle, Hild felt something settle in her that she did not have precise words for, a recognition that the particular chain of knowledge she had inherited from her own mother and passed to Ilswith in turn, through countless quiet evenings by the fire, was continuing now into a fourth generation, unbroken, uninterrupted by anything the wider, harder world had thrown at any of them along the way. There is a question I find myself turning over sometimes, thinking about a world like Hild's, that never quite has an obvious answer until you actually sit with it. How did anyone know what time it was? Not the season, which the natural world announced constantly and unmistakably, but the actual hour of a given day, the kind of precise, granular time that later centuries would come to take entirely for granted, glancing at a clock without a second thought. Witchcombe had no clock, no watch, nothing mechanical at all that measured time in the way we would now recognize, and yet the village ran, every single day, on a shared, functioning sense of time that everyone understood and coordinated around without any apparent difficulty. Much of it came from the sky itself, read with a fluency that Hild had absorbed so early in her life she could not remember actually learning it. The angle of light through the doorway told you, within perhaps half an hour's accuracy, how far the morning had progressed. The particular quality of shadow cast by the old oak at the Folkmoot's meeting ground served, for anyone who had lived nearby long enough to calibrate against it, as a rough sundial that half the village used without ever thinking of it in those terms. Roosters, predictably, announced the earliest hours with more enthusiasm than precision, and church bells, when the wind carried them clearly enough from the chapel, marked certain fixed points in the day tied to the pattern of prayer the church itself observed, hours that had names, though most villagers used them loosely, more as a general sense of where in the day's arc they currently stood than as anything approaching an exact measurement. Candles, too, could be pressed into service as a rough clock, when precision mattered enough to justify the waste. A candle marked with lines burning down at a roughly predictable rate, useful for timing something specific, a particular stage of brewing perhaps, or a vigil kept through part of a night. But mostly, time in Witchcombe was something felt rather than measured, a shared communal sense built from decades of collective experience with how long particular tasks actually took, how far the sun had to travel before the midday meal felt appropriate, how the quality of darkness itself shifted through the different watches of a long winter night. I think what strikes me most about this is how little anxiety it seemed to produce, at least as far as Hild ever expressed it. There was no sense in her world of time as a resource constantly slipping away, measured out in units small enough to feel scarce, the way it can feel now, with clocks in every room and device in every pocket counting down the minutes. Time in Witchcombe moved in larger, gentler units, tied to the actual rhythm of tasks and light and season rather than any abstract, uniform grid imposed on top of experience. A task took as long as it took. The day ended when the light thoroughly failed, not at some predetermined hour that light itself had to be artificially extended to match. There is something almost enviable in that, thinking about it now, a relationship with time that felt less like a resource being spent and more like a medium simply being lived inside. It was on one of these long winter nights, timed by nothing more precise than the fire's slow burn and the particular deep quality of full darkness outside, that Hild found herself sitting with her grandson, Bjorn's boy, now old enough at perhaps 8 or 9 to ask the kind of questions his father had once asked at the very same age. They had walked, that particular afternoon, near the old mill pond, and the boy, catching sight of the half-sunken stone with its worn, mysterious letters, had stopped and traced them with his finger exactly the way Bjorn himself had done as a child, asking the exact same question his father had once asked, "What do the letters say, grandmother?" and receiving, from Hild, the exact same honest answer nobody in Witchcombe had ever been able to improve upon in the decades since. "Nobody knows," she told him. "Nobody has known for longer than anyone alive can remember." But this time, unlike the first time she had heard the question asked so many years earlier, Hild found herself adding something more, watching her grandson turn the mystery over in his mind with the same open, unbothered curiosity his father had once shown. She told him about the road, the one that ran 2 miles from the village, half swallowed by bramble now, that had once been a proper paved Roman way, stones fitted so precisely together that a person could still, if they knew where to look, trace its ghost through the woods. She told him about the old place, the ruined town where nothing remained now but grass-grown foundations, where people had once lived in numbers and in a manner of life that nobody in Witchcombe could fully picture anymore, not because the knowledge was hidden, but because it had simply been lost, generation by generation, the way a fire goes out slowly, ember by ember, when nobody remains to feed it. She did not tell him this to frighten him, or even entirely to sadden him, though there was a kind of sadness in it that she did not try to hide from him either. She told him because she thought it mattered, that a boy growing up in this particular world should understand, early, how fragile knowledge actually was, how easily it could slip away if nobody troubled to pass it on, and how much, therefore, depended on the quiet, unglamorous work of exactly this kind of telling, an old woman sitting with a young child by a dying fire, offering him whatever fragments of understanding she had managed to gather and hold on to across a long life, so that he in turn might hold on to them a while longer himself, and perhaps one distant day pass some fraction of them on to a child of his own. Aelfric had a habit, one that Hild had noticed early in their marriage and had grown, over the years, to authentically treasure, of reaching for a particular kind of compressed proverbial wisdom whenever a situation called for guidance more than explanation. It was not unique to him. This was simply how a great deal of practical knowledge moved through a world like Witchcombe, packaged into short, memorable phrases that could be carried whole in memory and produced at exactly the moment they were needed, the way a craftsman reaches for a specific tool without needing to think about where it hangs on the wall. When Bjorn, still young at the time, had grown frustrated with a task he could not immediately master, Aelfric had told him, not unkindly, that a slow hand finishes the cloth while a quick hand only tangles the thread, a saying Hild recognized from her own father, though she could not have told you its actual origin any more than she could trace the origin of half the sayings that structured daily conversation in the village. When a neighbour complained, one autumn, about a harvest that seemed thin despite actually hard work, Osric, in the years before his death, had offered the observation that the field does not care how tired you are, only how well you listened to it in spring, a piece of wisdom that sounded almost harsh, stripped of its context, but that carried, within the community that used it, a shared understanding of exactly the kind of patient attentiveness good farming actually required. These sayings functioned as something more than mere decoration on ordinary speech. They carried, compressed into a handful of words, generations of accumulated practical observation, tested and refined the same way the household's medical knowledge had been tested and refined, kept because they proved useful and quietly discarded, over long stretches of time nobody could trace, if they stopped fitting the world as people actually experienced it. Weather lore made up a particularly rich vein of this inherited wisdom, and Hild could recite, without any particular effort, an entire catalogue of signs the village trusted to predict what the coming days or weeks might hold. A red sky at evening promised fair weather to follow, while the same colour at morning warned of a storm building. Smoke that hung low and reluctant to rise from a chimney meant rain was likely close. Something to do, Aelfric always claimed, though he could not have explained the actual mechanism, with a change in the weight and pressure of the air itself. Cows that lay down together in a field, rather than grazing scattered as they normally would, meant rain within the day. A sign Hild had tested against her own observation enough times over the years to trust as thoroughly as anything Wilfrid's Leech Book might have claimed with far greater apparent authority. Some of these sayings carried a wry, self-aware humour that Hild had always appreciated, the kind of practical wisdom that acknowledged its own limits even while offering itself as guidance. A borrowed tool returns duller than it left, went one, less a strict rule than a gentle warning about the particular friction that could arise between neighbours over shared implements, offered usually with a knowing look rather than genuine bitterness. Another, which Hild's own mother had used constantly enough that Hild now found herself using it on Ealhswith's own children without quite meaning to, held that a child who asks too many questions will grow into an adult who has too many answers, delivered always with enough warmth that no child actually receiving it took it as a real rebuke, understanding instinctively that it was closer to affectionate teasing than genuine complaint. I think what I find most moving about this whole tradition, thinking about it now, is how much genuine intelligence it represents, compressed into forms specifically designed to survive without ever being written down. A saying that fails to prove useful, that gives advice contradicted too often by actual experience, simply stops being repeated, drops quietly out of use, the way any tool that does not work eventually gets abandoned in favour of something better. What survives, generation after generation, passing from Osric to Hild to Ealhswith's own children, represents a kind of distilled, tested wisdom, refined not by any single brilliant mind, but by the accumulated, anonymous judgment of countless ordinary people across countless ordinary years, each one keeping what worked and letting go of what did not, until what remained had earned its place in memory the hard way, through simple, repeated, practical usefulness. Winter evenings, in the years after Ealhswith had married and moved to Wigmund's village, took on a quieter character in Hild and Aelfric's own house, the two of them settling into a rhythm shaped less by the noise and motion of raising children, and more by a companionable stillness that Hild found she treasured in its own particular way, different from the fuller, louder years, but not lesser for the difference. They still sat by the fire most evenings, Aelfric working at some small repair, with the same unhurried competence he had always brought to such tasks, Hild spinning or mending or simply sitting with her own thoughts, and it was in these quieter years that she found herself, more often than she might have expected, genuinely grateful for the shape her life had taken, for a marriage that had settled, across nearly 3 decades now, into something closer to easy companionship than the anxious uncertainty of its earliest days, for children grown into capable adults of their own, for grandchildren whose visits filled the house, when they came, with exactly the kind of joyful noise that made the quieter stretches between visits feel earned, rather than simply empty. Ceolwulf came through Witchcombe one final time that Hild would ever witness, an old man himself by then, his pack-horse replaced by a younger relative's cart, since his own knees, he admitted with the particular rueful humour of someone long past pretending otherwise, no longer forgave him for the distances his trade required. He sat by Hild and Aelfric's fire that evening, the way he had sat by it so many times across so many years, and the conversation between them carried a warmth that had accumulated slowly, visit by visit, decade by decade, until what had begun as the wary, transactional courtesy between a trader and a farming household had become, without either party quite noticing the transition, something closer to real friendship. He brought less news of the wider world than he once had. His circuit shortened now, his energy no longer stretching as far as it once did, but what he offered still carried the particular flavour of a life spent moving between places that never otherwise touched each other, fragments of politics and rumour and gossip from villages and halls Hild would never see with her own eyes. The kingdom, he told them, seemed to be settling, slowly, unevenly, into something more coherent than the patchwork Hild had known her whole life, alliances holding longer than they once did, a sense, difficult to pin down precisely but noticeable all the same, in the tenor of how people spoke about such matters, that the endless churn of small kingdoms rising and falling might be giving way, gradually, to something with more staying power. Ceolwulf mentioned, too, that the raiding along the coast had not stopped, would likely never entirely stop, but that certain regions had grown far more capable of meeting it, better organised, better warned, the beacon systems Hild remembered from her own younger years now supplemented, in some places, by more permanent arrangements, fortified points where a community could shelter properly, rather than simply watching and waiting and hoping the danger passed them by. It was not safety, not the kind of complete, guaranteed safety Hild suspected no century of human history had ever actually offered anyone, but it was progress of a real, tangible kind, the slow, hard-won accumulation of a society learning, however imperfectly, to meet a threat it could not eliminate but could at least learn to manage, with somewhat less helplessness than before. Aelfric, listening to all this with the particular quiet attention he brought to most conversations, observed that it was a strange thing, growing old enough to watch a world actually change shape around you, rather than simply hearing, as a young man, vague stories of a past too distant to feel real. He had been a boy, he reminded Ceolwulf, when the news of trouble along the coast first properly frightened this household, decades ago now, and here they sat, old enough themselves to be the ones offering the reassurance rather than needing it, old enough to have watched their own children grow into the kind of steady, capable adults who would in turn offer that same reassurance to children of their own. Ceolwulf agreed, with a particular weathered nod of a man who had spent his entire working life watching villages and households change in exactly this slow, cumulative way, one generation's fear becoming, gradually, the next generation's manageable inconvenience, not because the danger itself had vanished, but because the accumulated wisdom and preparation of each passing decade had chipped away at its power to clearly overwhelm. That, he said, was as close to progress as this world seemed to offer anyone, not the sudden, complete elimination of danger, but its slow, patient domestication, generation by generation, until what had once seemed an existential threat settled, gradually, into simply one more hazard among the many a sensible household learnt to plan around. He left the following morning, as he always had, before the household was fully stirring, though this time he paused at the door long enough to press Hild's hand between both of his own and tell her, with a directness unusual for a man who had built an entire trade around careful, measured speech, that of all the households along his circuit across all these many years, hers was the one he had most looked forward to reaching, the one that had made the long, tiring stretches of the road feel, somehow, worth the effort required to walk them. Hild found herself unexpectedly moved by this, standing in the doorway watching his cart disappear down the lane, and mentioned to Aelfric afterward that she rather hoped they would see the old trader again, though something in how he had said his goodbye that morning left her with the quiet suspicion that they might not. She was right, as it happened, though she would not learn of Ceolwulf's death until nearly a year later, second-hand, through another trader who had known him only slightly, and mentioned it almost in passing, the way news of a stranger's death often arrives, stripped of the particular texture that had made the man himself so vivid to the people who had actually known him. Hild grieved it quietly, in her own way, thinking of him often over the following weeks, this man who had walked into her life as a wary young trader when she herself was newly married, and had walked out of it, decades later, as something closer to family, one more thread in the long, accumulated fabric of a life that had turned out to be far richer in genuine connection than the quiet, isolated farming village of her girlhood might once have suggested was possible. There is a particular quality to the seasons when you have lived through enough of them to stop experiencing each one as new, and Hild found, in these later years, that she had come to love this quality rather than mourn it, the way a well-worn path through familiar woods can offer its own deep, settled pleasure precisely because you already know every turn it will take. Spring still arrived each year with its own small, specific signals, the same returning bird to the same hedge, the same softening of ground underfoot, but Hild met it now with the calm recognition of an old friend rather than the anxious anticipation of youth, and she found this recognition, if anything, deepened rather than diminished the pleasure she took in it. She spent more time in the small garden plot Ælfric had given her as her morning gift all those decades earlier, tending herbs and flax with a patience that had only grown more thorough with age. And it was here, on a particular clear morning, in what must have been her 52nd or 53rd year, that she found herself simply kneeling in the dirt for a while, hands still, doing nothing at all beyond feeling the sun on her back and listening to the specific, layered soundscape of a village morning she had heard, in one form or another, nearly every day of her adult life. Somewhere behind her, Ælfric's hammer, no longer wielded with the strength of his younger years, but still competent, still steady, working on some repair that would occupy an unhurried hour. Further off, the particular ring of iron on iron that meant Bjorn was at his own forge, close enough now, having settled in the village after all rather than moving elsewhere as young craftsmen sometimes did, that Hild could hear his work most days if the wind carried right. Birdsong, layered and constant, the specific mix of species that meant early summer rather than any other season, distinguishable to her ear the way a scholar might distinguish between languages, though she had never once thought of this knowledge as anything worth naming or remarking on, simply the ordinary furniture of a life spent this closely attuned to one particular stretch of English countryside. The evenings, especially through the long stretch of midsummer when darkness barely seemed to arrive at all before beginning its retreat again, carried their own particular texture, a lingering, golden quality of light that Hild had always found faintly melancholy in a way she could never quite explain, a beauty tinged with something like loss even though nothing was actually being lost, simply a day ending the way every day eventually ends. She and Ælfric took to walking, in these years, a short distance along the lane most evenings after the day's work was truly finished, no particular destination in mind, simply the pleasure of moving together through air, finally cooling after the day's heat, watching the light change colour as it dropped, talking about nothing of any particular consequence, or sometimes not talking at all, content simply to walk together in the kind of comfortable silence that only decades of genuine partnership can produce. It was on one of these walks the summer Hild turned 54 by her own reckoning, though nobody kept such precise count with any real confidence in that world, that Ælfric mentioned, almost offhand, that his own hands had begun troubling him more than they once had, a stiffness in the mornings that eased somewhat as the day progressed, but never entirely vanished, and Hild recognized, hearing this, the particular quiet honesty a marriage this long allows, the freedom to mention a small private frailty without any need to dress it up or minimize it first. She said nothing especially wise or comforting in response, only reached for his hand as they walked, the same hand that had gripped hers so steadily the night, decades earlier, she had finally told him about the dunes, and found that this simple gesture, offered and received without any need for further words, carried exactly the weight the moment required. I think there is something worth noticing in this particular stretch of a life, the stretch that comes after the great dramatic milestones. The marriage, the children, the grandchildren have already settled into their place, and what remains is simply the accumulated texture of two people continuing to choose each other, day after ordinary day, through nothing more dramatic than a shared walk down a familiar lane at the particular hour when the light turns gold. It is not the part of a story that tends to get told, historically speaking, this quiet, sustained middle distance of an ordinary marriage in an ordinary village, and yet I suspect it represents, more accurately than any single dramatic event could, what most of actual human life across most centuries has really consisted of, the slow accumulation of small chosen kindnesses, repeated so consistently across so many years that they eventually become, without either party quite noticing the transformation, something indistinguishable from love itself. It was Bjorn's own son, the boy who had once traced the letters on the mill-pond stone with the same wandering finger his father had used decades earlier, who brought home, one autumn evening well into his own young manhood, news that struck Hild as one of the stranger turns her long life had shown her. He had travelled, as young men of his trade sometimes did, some distance north on an errand connected to his own growing skill with iron, and had come back describing, with an ease that Hild found almost disorienting given everything her own girlhood had taught her to feel about the word, a settlement not far past the boundary of what people now spoke of with increasing frequency as land properly held by Norse families rather than English ones, where he had traded goods, eaten a meal, and found himself by the end of the evening in honestly friendly conversation with a blacksmith very much like himself, who happened to trace his own family back not to Wessex or Mercia, but to a longship that had come ashore and stayed 2 generations earlier. Hild sat with this for a long moment after her grandson finished telling it, turning it over the way she turned over most things that unsettled some old, deep assumption she had carried for most of her life without ever quite examining it. The word raider had meant, for the whole of her girlhood and much of her adult life, something singular and frightening, low shapes on the water, a memory of waiting on the dunes that had taken her decades to speak aloud even to her own husband. And here was her grandson, describing, with the casual ease of a young man discussing an ordinary trading trip, a blacksmith whose grandfather had likely arrived on English shores in exactly the manner of ship that had once made an 11-year-old girl's mother grip her hand hard enough to leave marks, and who was now, by all accounts, simply a neighbour, a fellow craftsman, a man whose forge produced good ironwork, and whose table apparently produced good hospitality. This is, I think, one of the deeply important and often underappreciated threads running through this entire period, easy to lose sight of if the story stops at the raids themselves and never follows the longer arc forward. The relationship between English and Norse communities across these decades was never simply one thing. It held real violence within it, undeniably, raids that burned and killed and displaced, memories like the one Hild had carried her whole life, entirely legitimate and entirely real, but running alongside that violence, sometimes following directly on its heels within the very same regions, ran something else entirely, a slower, quieter process of settlement, trade, intermarriage, and eventual coexistence, Norse families putting down roots in English soil, adopting English customs even as they preserved threads of their own, English families finding within a generation or two that the people they had once feared as raiders had become, in the most ordinary and unremarkable way imaginable, simply their neighbours. The boundary between what people called Danish-held land and what remained more firmly English was never a clean line, and would not fully resolve in either direction for many decades still to come, long after Hild herself would be gone from the world. But the seeds of that eventual, complicated blending were visible already, in exactly the kind of encounter her grandson described so casually, a young English smith and a young Norse smith finding, over a shared meal and a shared trade, that they had considerably more in common with each other as craftsmen and as neighbours than either of their grandparents' generations could ever have imagined possible. Hild found herself telling her grandson, that evening, a version of the story she had once told Aelfric alone, the dunes, the waiting, the particular fear that had shaped so much of her own girlhood, and watched him listen with the genuine, respectful attention of a young man encountering a piece of family history he had never fully heard before. He did not dismiss her fear, did not suggest that her memory was somehow wrong or outdated in light of the friendly blacksmith he had just described. He held both truths together, the way she herself had slowly learnt to hold them together across a very long life, the real, legitimate fear of one generation and the real, equally legitimate friendship of the next, not contradicting each other so much as simply representing the different chapters of a longer, more complicated story than either alone could tell. I want to sit with this for a moment, because I think it captures something true not only about this specific period, but about how history in general actually moves, messier and less linear than the tidy version so often told afterward. The fear was real. The friendship, a generation later, was equally real. Neither erased the other, both existed, layered one on top of the other within the very same family, within the very same stretch of English countryside, and Hild, sitting by her own fire listening to her grandson describe a blacksmith whose grandfather might well have crewed one of the very ships she had once watched from the dunes, found herself feeling something she had not entirely expected to feel about any of it. Not forgiveness exactly, since there was nothing specific to forgive in this particular telling, no wrong done directly to her, something closer to a kind of peace, the recognition that the world, given enough time, given enough patient, ordinary decades of people simply choosing to live alongside each other, tended to soften even its hardest edges into something more workable than fear alone could ever have predicted. There was a habit Hild had fallen into, in these later, quieter years, of naming things aloud as she passed them on her now slower walks around the village, not for any particular listener, simply for the pleasure of the words themselves. And it was on one such walk, with her granddaughter, Iltswith's own eldest girl, visiting for a stretch that summer, that the child asked her something that stopped Hild in her tracks for a moment, turning over an answer she realized she had never actually considered directly before. Why, the girl wanted to know, was the stream at the bottom of the lane called what it was called? Why did the hill above the village carry the particular name it carried? Who had decided? Hild found herself walking on slowly with her granddaughter's small hand in hers, explaining as best she could something she had absorbed so thoroughly across her own lifetime that she had entirely never stopped to examine it as a thing worth examining. Every feature of the land around Witchcombe carried a name, and every name, if you paid close enough attention, told you something, however faint and however uncertain, about the people who had lived on this land before, and the language they had spoken, and the way they had seen the world around them. The stream was named for a particular kind of reed that grew thick along its banks, a plant whose old name had outlasted, by that point, most other traces of whatever language the people who first named it had actually spoken day to day. The hill's name, older still and harder to fully explain, seemed to carry an echo of a word for watching or guarding, and Osric, back in his own lifetime, had once told Hild he believed it marked a place where lookouts had once been posted, back in some distant, unrecorded past nobody could now confirm with any real certainty. I think there is something quietly remarkable in this, the way a landscape itself becomes a kind of unintentional archive, holding fragments of memory that outlast every other form of record a society without much writing could produce. Nobody in Witchcombe could tell you, with any confidence, the political history of the region across the centuries before living memory began, but the land itself, simply by continuing to be called what it had always been called, preserved traces of that lost history anyway, embedded so deeply into ordinary daily speech that nobody even noticed they were carrying it, the way you might use a word every day of your life without ever pausing to wonder where it actually came from. Some of the names carried traces of a language older than English itself, older even than the Roman presence that had once paved the road 2 miles from the village, fragments of a Celtic tongue that had been spoken across this land long before either Rome or the ancestors of people like Hild had ever arrived, surviving now in nothing but the sound of certain rivers and hills, stubbornly outlasting empire after empire, language after language, in a way that struck Hild, turning it over on that summer walk with her granddaughter, as plainly moving once you actually stopped to consider it properly. Whole peoples had come and gone, their kingdoms risen and fallen, their languages spoken and then forgotten by everyone except the handful of scholars who might someday, in some distant future Hild could not imagine, take the trouble to reconstruct them. And yet a river kept flowing under more or less the same name it had always carried, indifferent to every human drama that had played out along its banks, a thread of continuity running underneath all the ruptures Hild had spent so many quiet evenings thinking about across her long life. She told her granddaughter as much of this as she thought the girl could hold at her age, which was not everything, but enough, she hoped, to plant something that might grow clearer with time, the way so much of what her own mother and Osric had told her across her own childhood had taken years to fully settle into understanding. The girl, for her part, seemed most struck by the simple fact that a stream could be older than anyone's memory of it, that something so ordinary, something she had waded in and splashed through countless times without a second thought, carried a name reaching back further than any person now living could actually trace. That is the thing about a landscape lived in this closely, across this many generations. Hild found herself thinking as they walked on. It stops being simply scenery, simply the backdrop against which human lives happen to unfold, and becomes instead something closer to a living participant in the story itself, holding memory the way a person holds memory, imperfectly, selectively, but sincerely, offering it back up to anyone patient enough to actually ask the right questions of it, the way her granddaughter had just asked, quite by accident, a question Hild suspected she would carry with her, in one form or another, for a very long time to come. On a visit to Wilfrid some years later, an errand that had become, by that stage of both their lives, more a matter of old friendship than any pressing medical need, Hild found the monk in an unusually reflective mood, sitting with a particular volume open on the table before him that he seemed reluctant to put fully away even as he attended to the ordinary business of examining Aelfric's persistently stiff hands. She asked eventually what held his attention so completely, and Wilfrid, with the quiet enthusiasm of a man given permission to discuss something he wholly loved, told her about a monk named Bede, who had lived and worked in a monastery far to the north, in Northumbria, and who had died, by Wilfrid's own reckoning, roughly a century before the conversation they were now having. Bede, Wilfrid explained, had done something that struck Hild, hearing it described as almost audaciously ambitious for a man who had spent nearly his entire life within the walls of a single religious house. He had set out to write a history not merely of his own monastery or his own small corner of England, but of the English people as a whole, gathering accounts from every source he could reach, letters exchanged with distant monasteries, oral testimony carefully collected and cross-checked, older documents that had survived in fragments here and there across the scattered religious houses of the land, and had woven all of it together into a single coherent account stretching back through the earliest arrival of Christianity in England, and further still into the older, dimmer memory of how the English people themselves had first come to this island in the first place. Wilfrid spoke of this achievement with a kind of reverence that Hild found thoroughly moving to witness, describing how Bede's work had become, in the century since his death, something close to the foundation stone for how English monasteries understood their own past, copied and recopied, studied by monks who had never met the man and never would, in monasteries he himself had never visited, his careful, painstaking labour outliving him by a margin that made Hild's own worries about memory and forgetting feel, for a moment, almost unnecessarily anxious. Here was proof, sitting on the table in front of her, that a single dedicated life, spent patiently gathering and preserving what might otherwise have been lost, could authentically succeed, could actually hold a thread of memory intact across a distance of time that would otherwise have swallowed it completely. I find myself thinking, whenever I return to this part of the story, about the peculiar debt every person living now owes to men like Bede, whose patient, unglamorous labour, copying and cross-checking and writing by candlelight in a cold scriptorium, is the actual reason we know anything at all, with any real confidence, about a period so often dismissed as fundamentally unknowable. Hild herself, sitting with Wilfrid that afternoon, could not have imagined that her own life, and the lives of everyone in Witchcombe, existed in a kind of historical shadow precisely because no one like Bede had ever turned his attention specifically toward a farming village of no particular importance, that the detailed, granular texture of daily life in places like Witchcombe would remain, for the most part, unrecorded and therefore, to later centuries, largely invisible, reconstructible only through inference and archaeology and careful, patient guesswork, rather than through the kind of direct testimony Bede had managed to preserve for the grander political and religious history of his age. There is something both humbling and, I think, quietly liberating in that asymmetry once you actually sit with it. The great political events, the kings and councils and church synods, survived because men like Bede thought them worth the enormous labour of writing down. The ordinary, daily texture of a life like Hild's survived, when it survived at all, almost by accident, glimpsed sideways through incidental mentions in documents concerned primarily with other matters entirely, or reconstructed centuries later through the physical evidence left behind in the ground, a discarded tool, a collapsed foundation, a scattering of animal bones that could tell a careful enough investigator what a household had eaten in a given season, long after every person who had actually eaten that meal was completely and permanently forgotten. And yet, I want to say plainly, sitting here telling you this story tonight, that the absence of a written record is not the same thing as the absence of a life fully lived. Hild's days were as real, as full of genuine feeling and genuine consequence to the people living them, as any kings, any councils, any battle Bede thought important enough to record for posterity. She simply lived them in a form that history, as it happened to be practiced in her own time, was not built to preserve. that she is remembered at all now in this telling, however invented the particular details necessarily are. However much any single life from this period must be imagined rather than documented directly, is itself a small act of the very same impulse that drove Bede to his desk each morning, the stubborn, patient conviction that ordinary lives, lived with care and attention, are worth the effort of remembering, whatever form that remembering ultimately has to take. The years had a way of doing this, circling back on themselves just enough that an ordinary evening could suddenly feel like an echo of one long past. Autumn came again, as it always did, and Hild found herself one particular evening well past what most people would call the middle of her life, standing once more in the small yard behind the house, checking on a batch of ale settling in its vessel exactly as she had done so many autumns before, the specific echo of it striking her only after she had already been standing there a while, watching her own breath cloud faintly in air just beginning to carry winter's first real edge. The animals shifted somewhere behind her in the byre, the same soft, companionable sound she had listened to for decades now, a sound so familiar it had become, in its way, almost indistinguishable from silence itself. Smoke rose thin and straight from the roof of the house, no wind at all to bend it, and somewhere down the lane a dog barked twice and fell quiet, and Hild stood there longer than the task in front of her strictly required, the way she had stood there so many times before, simply letting the ordinary, accumulated weight of an entire life lived in this one particular place settle over her. She thought, standing there, about the girl she had once been, 11 years old on a stretch of dune 2 days' journey from where she now stood, gripping her mother's hand hard enough to leave marks, watching low shapes move across water that had, in the end, passed her own village by that particular morning, though not every village, not every family, along that same stretch of coast had been so fortunate across the many years since. She thought about the young woman she had been at 17, arriving in Witchcombe as a stranger to marry a man she had met only a handful of times before the wedding itself, uncertain whether the careful arrangement her parents had negotiated would actually suit the two people it most concerned, and how thoroughly, across the decades since, that uncertainty had resolved itself into something she now could not imagine her life without. She thought about her children, grown now into their own full, separate lives, capable and settled and, as far as she could tell, clearly happy in the particular way that mattered most to a mother watching from a slight, necessary distance. She thought about her grandchildren, scattered now between Witchcombe and Wickman's village, and, in her eldest grandson's case, apparently as far as friendly conversation with a Norse blacksmith some distance to the north, each of them carrying forward some fraction of everything she and Aelfric had spent a lifetime trying to teach them. And she thought too, standing in that quiet yard, with the ale settling steadily beside her, about all the things she would never know, could never know, no matter how long she lived or how carefully she paid attention. She would not see whatever eventual shape the fractured kingdoms of her girlhood finally settled into, whether the slow consolidation Ceolwulf had described in his final visits would hold, or crack, or take some form none of them could currently imagine. She would not know whether the threads of learning kept so carefully alive behind monastery walls like Wilfrid's would grow and flourish in the centuries ahead, or whether they would face some new threat capable of snapping them as thoroughly as the collapse of Roman administration had once snapped so much of what came before. She would not know what became of the stone by the mill pond, whether some future generation, centuries hence, might finally find someone capable of reading what it said, or whether it would simply continue sinking, slowly, into the mud, its message intact and forever inaccessible, a small, stubborn mystery outlasting every person who had ever stood beside it, wondering. None of that not knowing troubled her especially, not any more, not the way it might have troubled a younger version of herself less practiced in the particular art of living fully inside genuine uncertainty. She had spent her entire life, after all, inside exactly this condition, one season following another, without any guarantee of what the next would bring. 1 year's harvest never fully certain until it was actually standing in the barn. One piece of news from the coast never quite resolving into something she could plan around with real confidence, and she had built, inside that uncertainty, across all these many years, a life she recognized, standing quietly in her own yard on this particular autumn evening, as truly deeply good, full of hard-won competence and real warmth and people she loved and who loved her in return, and she found herself thinking that this, in the end, was perhaps the truest answer anyone could ever give to the enormous, unanswerable uncertainty of living inside history without being able to see its shape, not to solve the uncertainty, which could not be solved, but simply to build, patiently and stubbornly, something worth having regardless of how the larger story eventually turned out. The fire, when she finally went back inside, had burned down to the particular bed of steady low coals that meant the evening had properly arrived, and Aelfric looked up from whatever small task occupied his hands and asked with the easy, familiar warmth of 30-odd years of exactly this same question, asked in exactly this same way, whether she had finished checking on the ale, and Hild said that she had, and came to sit beside him, and the two of them settled into the particular, wordless comfort of two people who had long since stopped needing conversation to fill every quiet moment they shared. That particular winter's first snow came early and came heavy, enough that Bjorn walked over from his own house the following morning specifically to check that the roof of his parents' home had held under the weight, a habit he had fallen into these past few years without either Hild or Aelfric ever quite asking him to. The quiet, unremarked way a grown child begins looking after aging parents long before anyone involved is willing to name the shift out loud. Hild watched him from the doorway, clearing snow from the path with the same steady, unhurried competence he had once used to make his father's fence posts sit properly in frozen ground, and felt a particular kind of pride that had nothing showy about it, simply the deep, settled satisfaction of watching a person she had raised move through the world with genuine capability and genuine care for the people around him. The village itself, under that first heavy snow, took on the particular hushed quality Hild had always loved best about deep winter. Every sound softened, every hard edge rounded, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys into a sky so pale, and still it seemed to be holding its breath along with everything beneath it. She stood in the doorway a while longer than the cold really recommended, watching her breath cloud and dissolve, listening to the specific, muffled quiet that only a fresh, undisturbed snowfall could produce, and found herself thinking, not for the first time that season, about how many winters she had now watched arrive in exactly this way, each one distinct in its particular details, and yet each one, underneath those details, carrying the same essential shape, the same slow settling in, the same patient turning inward that the whole household, the whole village had learnt across generations to meet not with dread, but with a kind of practiced, hard-won readiness. Ealhswith visited that winter with her own children, now nearly grown themselves, staying long enough that the house filled, for a few precious weeks, with exactly the kind of noise and motion Hild remembered from decades earlier, when her own children had been small and the house had rarely known a really quiet moment. She found herself watching her daughter now moving through middle age with the same steady competence Hild herself had grown into, at roughly the same stage, struck by how completely the shape of her own life seemed to be repeating itself. One generation down, the same rhythms, the same rituals, the same accumulated wisdom passed hand to hand exactly as it had always been passed, and she found this repetition, rather than feeling in any way diminishing, honestly comforting, proof that whatever she and Aelfric had built together across their own long marriage had proven sturdy enough to actually continue, to actually matter beyond the boundaries of their own two lifetimes. There was an evening, deep in that particular winter, snow still thick on the ground outside, and the fire built up larger than strict economy usually allowed, when the whole extended family found itself gathered under one roof for the first time in longer than Hild could easily remember. Bjorn and his wife and their children, Ealhswith and Wigmund and their own brood. The small house filled almost past its capacity with warmth and noise, and a particular chaos of too many people trying to talk at once. Hild sat somewhat apart from the thick of it, in the chair nearest the fire that had become, without any formal declaration, simply hers over the years, and watched the whole scene with a quiet, private happiness that she did not feel any particular need to announce or explain to anyone else in the room. Aelfric caught her eye at one point, across the crowded room, and something passed between them in that look, the same wordless communication that had carried them through 30-odd years of marriage, an entire conversation compressed into a single shared glance, acknowledging, without either of them needing to say it aloud, how deeply, improbably fortunate they had been, across a life that had offered no guarantees of any kind, to arrive at this particular evening, this particular room, this particular gathering of people who existed, every single one of them, because two frightened, hopeful young people had chosen each other decades earlier and had spent every year since simply showing up for the life that choice had produced. There was a word Osric had used often, back in his own lifetime, that Hild found herself returning to more and more as her own years accumulated, a word that did not translate easily into anything the Church's own language quite captured, though the two ideas sat close enough together that most people in Witchcombe moved between them without much sense of contradiction. Wide, Osric had called it, the particular, personal shape a person's life seemed to take, not quite fate in the sense of something fixed and unchangeable from birth, but something closer to the accumulated weight of circumstance and choice and consequence, the way a river's course is shaped both by the land it flows through and by the water's own persistent, patient pressure against that land, neither entirely free nor entirely determined, something more complicated and more true than either extreme alone could capture. Hild had turned this idea over countless times across her life, most often in the quiet hours of exactly the kind she was sitting in now, and had never quite settled on whether she believed in it the way Osric seemed to have believed in it, as something close to a genuine force moving through the world, or whether it was simply a useful way of describing, after the fact, the plain accumulation of ordinary cause and consequence that shaped any life. Her own wired, if that was the right word for it, had carried her from a small coastal village to Witchcombe, from an anxious 17-year-old bride to a woman who had buried a beloved neighbour and welcomed grandchildren and stood, more times than she could count, in this exact spot, by this exact fire, turning over exactly this kind of quiet, unresolved thought. She could trace the causes easily enough: her parents' decision to arrange the match with Alfric, the particular harvest years that had shaped the family's fortunes, the raid that never came, the raid that did come to villages not so very far away, decisions made by people she would never meet, in places she would never see, that had nonetheless reached all the way into the shape of her own small, particular life. And yet naming all of those causes never quite explained the whole of it, not really, not in any way that fully satisfied the deeper question underneath. Why this life and not some other? Why this village, this husband, this particular accumulation of loss and joy and ordinary labour, rather than any of the countless other shapes a life might have taken from that same starting point? The Church offered one answer: providence, a plan held in a mind larger and wiser than any human mind could fully grasp, every apparent accident actually woven, invisibly, into some larger and ultimately good design. The older way of thinking, the way Osric had carried forward from his own grandparents, offered something both similar and subtly different, a ward that was personal and specific to each individual life, less a grand cosmic design, and more a kind of accumulated momentum, built from choices and circumstances, layered one on top of another, until they became, together, something that felt, from the inside, almost like destiny, even though no single moment along the way had felt inevitable while it was actually happening. Hild found, in these later years, that she had settled into something that borrowed a little from both without fully committing to either, a quiet, private theology assembled the same patient, practical way she had assembled every other piece of hard-won wisdom across her life, keeping what proved useful and letting go of what did not, without much concern for whether the resulting mixture would have satisfied a priest's careful doctrine or an old pagan's inherited certainty. She believed, in some fashion she could not have fully articulated if pressed, that her life had unfolded the way it needed to unfold, not because every individual event within it had been good, some clearly had not been, but because the whole shape of it, viewed now from the vantage point of a woman old enough to see most of it laid out behind her, held together with a coherence that felt, whatever word you wanted to put on it, entirely meaningful rather than simply random. She thought, turning all of this over yet again on this particular quiet night, about the girl on the dunes, 11 years old and frozen with a fear she would carry, unspoken, for over 20 years, before finally setting it down in the safety of her own husband's steady hands. That fear had shaped her, undeniably, had made her the particular kind of mother she became, watchful in ways some other mothers were not, quicker to comfort a child's nighttime fears because she remembered so precisely what her own unaddressed fears had cost her across so many silent years. Would she have been a different mother, a different woman entirely, without that morning on the dunes? Almost surely. Would that different woman have been better or worse, or simply different in ways impossible to weigh against the actual life she had actually lived? There was no way to know, no way to run the accounting against a life that had never happened, and Hild found, turning the unanswerable question over one final time before finally letting it go, that she did not especially want to know. She wanted, simply, the life she had actually lived, fear and joy and ordinary labour, and all of it woven together into a shape she recognized, sitting here now in the settling dark, as unmistakably, irreplaceably her own. There was a change that came to Witchcombe itself, slow and almost imperceptible in any single year, but unmistakable across the span of Hild's own lifetime, concerning the small wooden chapel that had stood at the heart of the village for as long as anyone could remember. It had always been built the way most buildings in Witchcombe were built, timber and wattle and a thatched roof that needed constant, patient attention to keep weather-tight, rebuilt more than once across the generations as age and weather took their inevitable toll on wood never meant to last forever. But in the years after Elswith's own children had grown past their earliest childhood, word came from the Thagorn's Hall that a portion of stone quarried some distance off and hauled in with real effort and real expense would be used to rebuild the chapel properly, a project that would take years rather than the single busy season a wooden rebuilding might have required. Hild watched this project unfold with a quiet fascination that surprised her, given how little she had ever thought about the church building itself beyond its ordinary familiar function in her weekly life. Stone construction demanded a completely different kind of skill than anything Witchcombe's own craftsmen ordinarily practiced, and masons arrived from elsewhere, strangers to the village who nonetheless settled, over the months of their work, into something like temporary neighbours, lodging with various households, including, for one particular stretch, a quiet, careful man named Osgar who stayed with Hild and Alfric themselves, and who Hild came to plainly enjoy having underfoot, full of stories about other churches he had helped raise in other villages across a working life spent travelling wherever stone construction was wanted. Watching the walls rise, course by careful course, taught Hild something about permanence she found herself thinking about long after the chapel was finally finished and consecrated. Wood, however carefully tended, however lovingly rebuilt generation after generation, remained a material fundamentally in conversation with decay, a structure you maintained rather than a structure that simply endured on its own. Stone offered something different, a building that might sincerely outlast not only Hild's own lifetime, but her children's and grandchildren's as well. A structure that could in principle stand largely unchanged for centuries, the way the old Roman road had stood, in its own broken, half-forgotten fashion, for centuries already. There was something in this that connected in Hild's mind back to all those long-ago conversations with Wilfrid about books and memory and the fragile, effortful work of preserving anything at all across the gap of generations. A stone chapel once raised required none of the same anxious, continuous tending that a wooden one demanded, none of the same risk that a single bad storm or a single neglected repair might undo decades of accumulated care. It simply stood, patient and solid, doing its work of shelter and worship, without asking much of anyone beyond the occasional necessary repair, and Hild found herself wondering, watching the final stones set into place, whether her own great-grandchildren, people she would never meet, might someday stand inside these very walls, worshipping in the same space under the same roof, entirely unaware of the particular autumn when a quiet stranger named Osgar had lodged in her own house and told stories by her own fire, while the walls slowly rose around the village's oldest gathering place. The old wooden chapel, dismantled once the new stone structure was ready to receive its congregation, was not entirely wasted, its sound timbers repurposed into other buildings around the village, one particular beam finding its way, Hild noted with a private, sentimental satisfaction she did not bother explaining to anyone, into a small addition Bjorn built onto his own forge that same year, so that some fragment of the building where Hild had been married, where her children had been christened, where Osric's funeral had been held, continued on in an entirely different form, sheltering an entirely different kind of work, the old and new woven together in exactly the patient, practical way most things in Witchcombe seem to weave together, nothing entirely lost, nothing entirely unchanged, everything simply continuing, in whatever form circumstance and necessity allowed it to continue. It was watching her great-grandchildren, on a visit some years further on than the chapel's rebuilding, that Hild found herself struck once more by just how much of a culture without books actually managed to preserve itself through channels so ordinary that nobody thought to call them preservation at all. The children, playing some counting game in the yard while the adults talked by the fire, chanted a rhyme Hild recognized instantly, word for word, as the exact same rhyme she herself had chanted as a small girl, decades and decades earlier, in a village 2 days' journey from here that most of these particular children would never see with their own eyes. She had never written it down, obviously, had never needed to, had simply carried it, intact, across an entire lifetime, through marriage and childbirth and every other transformation a life this long inevitably brings, and had passed it, without any particular ceremony, to her own children, who had passed it, in turn, to theirs, the rhyme itself travelling forward through the generations with a fidelity that would have impressed even Wilfrid's most careful scribes, preserved not through ink and parchment, but through the simple, durable mechanism of children delighting in the exact same words their parents had once delighted in, wanting them repeated exactly, correcting any adult who dared to alter so much as a single syllable. There was a whole world of this kind of knowledge, Hild reflected, watching the game continue, running parallel to everything Wilfrid and his brothers so carefully guarded behind their monastery walls, an entirely separate current of cultural memory, carried not by monks but by mothers and grandmothers and children themselves, encoding, in forms so playful and unassuming that nobody ever thought to treat them with the same reverence given to a proper book, genuine fragments of history and belief and practical wisdom that had travelled just as far, just as faithfully, across just as many generations. Some of the counting rhymes, she suspected, though she could not have proven it to anyone, carried echoes of numbers and words from a language older than English itself, worn smooth by centuries of children's mouths until their original meaning had long since dissolved, leaving behind only the shape and rhythm of the thing, delightful and mysterious, in exactly the way the stone by the mill pond was mysterious, a message whose original sense had been lost while its outer form stubbornly persisted. She found herself telling one of the older children this, that the rhyme they were chanting so carelessly was itself a kind of very old inheritance, older by far than the chapel's new stone walls, older, possibly, than anyone in Witchcombe could actually trace with confidence and watch the news land on the child with a brief flicker of surprised interest before the game itself reclaimed her attention entirely, which struck Hild as exactly the right response, exactly the way this kind of knowledge was always meant to be carried, lightly, without excessive solemnity, treasured not because anyone announced its importance, but simply because it was fun enough, catchy enough, woven deeply enough into the ordinary pleasure of childhood to survive on its own considerable merits, generation after generation, without anyone ever needing to explain why it mattered. Beorn's forge, in these later years, had grown into something considerably more than the modest operation he had first established after finishing his apprenticeship, and Hild found herself, on quiet afternoons when her own tasks allowed it, still drawn to visit and simply watch her son work, the way she had watched him as a boy learning the trade decades earlier, though the watching itself had changed character entirely across the years between. Where she had once watched with the anxious hope of a mother wondering whether her son's fascination would actually translate into a viable trade, she now watched with the settled, uncomplicated pleasure of a woman observing genuine mastery, a craft fully inhabited rather than merely learned. The sounds of the forge had become, across so many years of proximity, something close to music in Hild's own ears, the particular rhythm of hammer against heated iron, quick and light for fine work, heavier and more deliberate for anything structural, the hiss of metal plunged into the water trough, the steady breathing rasp of the bellows that Beorn's own son now worked most days, having taken up, in his turn, exactly the apprentice's role his father had once occupied under the previous smith, There was a particular smell to the place too, hot metal and charcoal smoke, and something faintly mineral underneath it all, that Hild associated so completely with her son by this point that she sometimes caught its edge on his clothes, even when he visited the house well after the day's work had ended, and found the smell, rather than unpleasant, almost comforting, the specific, embodied signature of a life spent doing skilled, necessary work well. Watching a length of raw iron transform under Bjorn's careful, practiced hands into something wholly useful, a plough blade, a cooking implement, the small, sturdy tools that every household in the district eventually needed and that only a handful of trained hands could actually produce, Hild found herself thinking about how thoroughly this single skill had reshaped not only her son's own life, but the whole practical texture of everyone around him. How many fields ploughed more easily because of blades he had shaped, how many meals cooked more safely because of implements his forge had produced. An entire quiet, cumulative contribution to the well-being of people who likely never thought twice about where their tools had actually come from, simply trusting that the smith would have what was needed when the need arose, the way people trust the sun to rise, without giving much thought to the vast, complicated mechanics actually underlying that daily reliability. There is a kind of legacy in that, I think, quieter and less celebrated than the legacy of kings or Scops or even monks like Wilfrid and Bed, but no less real for its quietness. A field ploughed more easily because of a well-made blade, a meal cooked more safely because of a sturdy pot, a whole village's daily competence, built up over generations from countless small contributions like these, each one unremarkable on its own, each one, taken together, forming the actual, load-bearing structure of a functioning community. Hild had come, across her long life, to trust this kind of legacy more than any other, the accumulated weight of ordinary people doing ordinary work well, day after day, year after year, asking for no particular recognition and receiving, mostly, none, and building, nonetheless, something thoroughly lasting out of nothing more dramatic than patient, careful attention to the task actually in front of them. Aelfric himself had never sought recognition for anything across his own working life, content simply to tend his fields and his animals and his family with the same unhurried, unglamorous diligence year after year. And Hild had come to understand, watching him now in the particular slower rhythm of his later years, that this quiet consistency was itself a kind of achievement rarely named as such but deeply felt by everyone who benefited from it. A household fed reliably through 30-odd winters, a wife whose fears once finally spoken were met with steady hands rather than dismissal, children raised with enough security and enough tenderness that they had grown into adults capable of offering that same steadiness to children of their own. None of it would ever appear in any chronicle, any leech book, any careful record kept by monks in a scriptorium far from Witchcombe, and yet Hild found, turning it over on this particular quiet evening, that she would not have traded a single year of it for any grander, more visible kind of life, that the whole slow, patient accumulation of ordinary faithfulness, hers and Aelfric's both, had produced something she recognized, without any hesitation at all, as a life fully and genuinely well lived. She thought of all this while the room around her stayed full and warm and loud with family, the fire still built up high enough to throw real light across every face gathered near it, nobody yet ready to call the evening finished, the night still holding, for a while longer, all the easy, unhurried pleasure of people glad simply to be under one roof together. Bjorn's forge, meanwhile, continued its steady rhythm long after Hild herself had gone to bed most nights, the young apprentices he now trained carrying the trade forward exactly as he himself had once carried it forward from the smith before him, one more thread in a chain that showed no sign of breaking. The gathering thinned eventually, the way gatherings always do, children falling asleep first, tucked into whatever corner of the house could be spared for them, then the adults following one by one, until only Hild and Aelfric remained properly awake, sitting together by a fire that had burnt down to the same steady bed of low coals it always reached at this particular hour of a long, full evening. Bjorn and his family would stay the night, as would Alswith's, the house arranged into sleeping bodies in every available space the way it had not been arranged in years, and Hild found the sound of it, the soft, layered breathing of an entire family settled under one roof, more soothing than any silence could have been. She rose eventually to check the fire one last time before joining Aelfric in the small space that remained their own, and paused on her way past the window to look out at the snow one more time, pale and blue in whatever thin light the moon offered through the clouds, the whole village outside sleeping under it. Every household she had known across her long life settled into exactly this same quiet, this same patient waiting out of winter's deepest stretch. Somewhere out there the old mill pond sat frozen at its edges, the stone with its unreadable letters buried now under snow that would not fully clear until spring. Somewhere further off, the old Roman road lay exactly as it had lain for as long as anyone could remember, half swallowed by the woods, carrying its silent testimony to a world that had come and gone and left behind nothing but this stubborn, crumbling trace. Somewhere further still, beyond the edges of anything Hild herself had ever seen with her own eyes, the wider world continued its own slow, uncertain turning, kingdoms consolidating, threats rising and receding, the whole enormous, unknowable shape of history moving forward in directions no single person living inside any given moment of it could ever fully perceive. None of that, tonight, needed to be understood or resolved or worried over any further. Tonight there was only this: a house full of sleeping family, a fire settling toward embers, a wife turning back from the window toward a husband who had already stretched out and was watching her with the particular soft, unhurried patience of a man in no rush at all for her to finish whatever quiet thoughts had briefly pulled her attention elsewhere. She crossed the room and lay down beside him, and he shifted to make space the way he had made space beside her for more years than either of them could now easily count, and the last of the fire's light moved gently across the low ceiling, catching the edges of things, softening slowly toward full dark. Hild closed her eyes, feeling the particular, settled tiredness of a day spent almost entirely on other people's happiness. Somewhere in the house a child murmured something soft in sleep and settled again. Somewhere outside, snow continued falling, silent and steady, filling in whatever tracks the day had left across the yard, smoothing the whole visible world back toward the same soft, unbroken quiet it had worn before any of them had ever walked across it. The fire dimmed further, the room grew fully dark, and the house and the family inside it, and the village around them, and the whole wide, uncertain, unfinished world beyond that, settled, together, into the particular deep stillness that only the middle of a long winter night can offer. Everything held, for these few hours at least, in a kind of suspended peace, waiting, unhurried, for whatever the morning would eventually bring. And somewhere in that stillness, if you have let yourself sink as deeply into it as I hope you have by now, I suspect you are already most of the way towards sleep yourself. So I will leave you here, in that quiet house, in that quiet village, on that quiet, snow-softened night, with nothing left to do but let the last of the light go, and let the day go with it, and rest.